So before I can get started reading, I probably should tell you a little bit about this. Comedy is one of those works that. So here's my plan. I am going to read it. Um, I may pause occasionally to give background into what's happening, what's being talked about. I might save some of that for the ends of Cantos. I might read through some of the thing is that a lot of Inferno, a lot of Dante's work in particular, kind of requires that you have some familiarity that you would have if you lived in 14th century Italy, though there was no such thing as Italy in the 14th century. If you lived in these areas in the 14th century, if you lived in medieval Europe, you'd probably have some familiarity with it. We lack a lot of that context these days, which does make comedy very difficult to read. So I'll probably try to provide some of that along the way and talk about some other things. I don't know. This is like half a reading stream and half just me getting to sit here and talk about Dante. I don't know. Y'all in for it? Okay, so a few things that you need to know before we get started. It's not super clear when Inferno or when any of comedy was written. It's believed that it was started sometime around 1308 and finished sometime around 1321, but Dante was in exile at the time. He was constantly on the move, and so the method by which it was written was incredibly fraught. Sometimes he was the ward of, Florentine warlords, as it were, at times. There were times where he was just kind of on the move because he was, exiled from his home. He ended up living many years in Ravenna and died there in the end. Does it matter what he was exiled for? It was for political. He was a white Guelph. So the political breakdown in Florence at the time was that it was the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines supported the papacy, and the Ghibellines supported the empire at the time, and the Guelphs supported the papacy, and the Ghibellines were absolutely destroyed in the process. They lost big time, and Dante was a Guelph, but the Guelphs had kind of messiness of their own. There was a split, a faction between them, the white Guelphs versus the black Guelphs, which both supported kind of allowing the papacy to rule Florence at the time. But in the end, the Pope ended up backing the black Guelphs and ended up exiling the white Guelphs from Florence. So it wasn't necessarily that he did anything particularly wrong. Probably did plenty of things wrong, but the exile was specifically because the white Guelphs were exiled. There were a few prominent families among the white Guelphs. There was the Donatis, which was actually the family that Dante married into. His wife was a member of the Donati family. Though, if you're familiar at all with comedy, you know that Dante loved another, a woman that he had met when he was quite young and had some minor interactions with, named Beatrice. I'm not going to try to pronounce super accurately, but Beatrice is more correct than Beatrice, which is what most people would say. I'm not going to try to flip my R's. I'm sorry, Beatrice. In my head, I feel like I can always flip my R's really well, but as soon as it tries to come out of my mouth, I just get tongue-tied. So, Beatrice. Beatrice. There you go. That's the best. Um, but he was kind of he was familiar with her. He had connections through his family. They had met 3 times in his life. They'd only met 3 times in his life, and he was madly in love with her, like almost maddeningly so. Dante at the time, for what it's worth, was a poet of real middling stature. He was not at all known as a talented poet. In fact, if anyone knew Dante at the time, he would have been much better known as a politician in Florence. He had served as podesta at least once. Podesta is kind of like what we would consider to be the mayor of a town, but it's a really short term, and you serve like with a council of people. But he was a middling author, poet. He had written the Convivio. He had written La Vita Nuova. He had written a few things. He wasn't very well known. So, like, when people think of him as this, like, amazing poet of great renown, that's purely from Inferno. At the time, he wouldn't have really been known for much of anything. Anyway, he had kind of idealized Beatrice so much, and viewed her as this idyllic perfection of beauty, and kind of focused all of his religious energy into her, religiosity into her. He writes of her in La Vita Nuova. If you ever read that, it speaks a lot of Beatrice. Where am I going with this? I'm trying to catch you up on, like, what you need to know. Anyway, he's in exile. It's important to view comedy as a story of exile. It's important to recognize comedy as representing a man who has lost his home and is searching for something. If you frame comedy through that lens, it better matches what he was like, the spirit of comedy. And on top of that, it actually matches a lot of it has a lot of similarities with a lot of other works of exile. For instance, Virgil's the Aeneid. If you're familiar with the Aeneid, and you will become more familiar with the Aeneid the more you read comedy, because Dante is a great fan of Virgil, it turns out. There's a lot of parallels there. You will become familiar with the Aeneid. No, I mean, we go on a journey with Virgil, and the Aeneid plays a fairly significant role. The only other thing that I think I'll say before I get started, I don't know the history of Florence well enough. I've learned the history of Florence in my self-study. But the last thing I'll mention, and something that most people are probably familiar with, is the construction of Inferno, the construction of comedy. First off, it's not called the Divine Comedy. That moniker was not given to it until several hundred years after Dante's death, because I guess people felt uncomfortable just calling it comedy. The name of the work is Comedy. It is split into 100 cantos, 100 being the most perfect number. 34 cantos for Inferno, 33 for Purgatorio, and 33 for Paradiso. Of course, of those 34 in Inferno, the first one is really sort of an introduction to the whole thing, so you could really view it as the first canto being an introduction, and then 33 for each of the others. And each of the cantos themselves are written in a rhyming scheme called terza rima. I am not reading a version that attempts to preserve the rhyming. I'm reading a version that preserves accuracy, at least attempts to. So it will not rhyme as I read it, but it was originally written in a rhyming scheme called terza rima, in which the rhyming scheme is sort of A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, and it provides this sort of driving motion where each line provides a rhyme that is going to come up in the next terzet. And in addition to that, the last tercet of each canto is actually a quatrain, I guess. Usually, when people transcribe it, it's written with the last line actually being part of the last tercet, so it's actually 4 lines. The poem's quite significant in size. Most cantos average about 120-something lines. The whole poem is, 14,233 lines? Something like that. It's just, it's a significant work. So, I'm going to start now. I'm going to start reading, and I may interrupt myself occasionally. I may just dump a bunch of, thoughts and notes at the end of each canto. I don't know how I want to do this. I have no idea. I just kind of want to read Inferno. So, midway through the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it is like. This wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn, the thought of it brings back all my old fears. A bitter place, death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good. How I entered there I cannot truly say. I had become so sleepy at the moment when I first strayed, leaving the path of truth. But when I found myself at the foot of a hill, at the edge of the wood's beginning, down in the valley, where I first felt my heart plunge deep in fear, I raised my head and saw the hilltop shawled in morning rays of light sent from the planet that leads men straight on every road. And then, only did terror start subsiding in my heart's lake, which rose to heights of fear that night I spent in deepest desperation. Just as a swimmer, still with panting breath, now safe upon the shore, out of the deep, might turn for one last look at the dangerous waters, so I, although my mind was turned to flee, turned round to gaze once more upon the past that never let a living soul escape. I rested my tired body there a while, and then began to climb the barren slope. I dragged my stronger foot and limped along. Beyond the point, the slope begins to rise, sprang up a leopard, trim and very swift. It was covered by a pelt of many spots, and everywhere I looked, the beast was there blocking my way. So time and time again, I was about to turn and go back down. The hour was early in the morning then. The sun was climbing up with those same stars that had accompanied it on the world's first day, the day divine love set their beauty turning, so the hour and sweet season of creation encouraged me to think I could get past that gaudy beast, wild in its spotted pelt. But then good hope gave way and fear returned when the figure of a lion loomed up before me, and he was coming straight toward me, it seemed, with head held high and furious with hunger. The air around him started to seem to fear its presence. And now a she-wolf came, and in her leanness seemed racked with every kind of greediness. How many people she has brought to grief. This last beast brought my spirit down so low with fear that seized me at the sight of her. I lost all hope of going up the hill. As a man who, rejoicing in his gain, suddenly seeing his gain turn into loss, will grieve as he compares his then and now, so she made me do, that relentless beast, coming toward me slowly, step by step, she forced me back to where the sun is mute. While I was rushing down to that low place, my eyes made out a figure coming toward me. One grown faint, perhaps from too much silence. And when I saw him standing in this wasteland, "Have pity on my soul," I cried to him. "Whichever you are, shade or living man." "No longer living man, though once I was," he said, "and my parents from Lombardy. Both of them were Mantuans by birth. I was born, though somewhat late, sub Julio, and lived in Rome when good Augustus reigned, and when the false and lying gods were worshipped. I was a poet and sang of that man, son of Anchises, who sailed off from Troy after the burning proud Ilium. Why retreat so much misery? Why not climb up this blissful mountain here, the beginning and source of all man's joy?" "Are you then Virgil? Are you then that fount from which pours forth so rich a stream of words?" I said to him, bowing my head modestly. O light and honor of other poets, may my long years of study and that deep love that made me search your verses help me now. You are my teacher, the first of all my authors, and you alone the one from whom I took the noble style that was to bring me honor. You see the beast that forced me retreat. Save me from her. I beg you, famous sage. She makes me tremble. The blood throbs in my veins. But you must journey another road, he answered, when he saw me lost in tears, if ever you hope to leave this wilderness. This beast, the one you cry about in fear, allows no soul to succeed along her path. She blocks his way and puts an end to him. She is, by nature, so perverse and vicious, her craving belly is never satisfied, still hungering for food the more she eats. She mates with many creatures, and will go on mating with more until the greyhound comes and tracks her down to make her die in anguish. He will not feed on either land or money. His wisdom, love, and virtue shall sustain him. He will be born between Feltro and Feltro. He comes to save that fallen Italy, for which the maid Camilla gave her life, and Turnus, Nisus, Euralius died of wounds. And he will hunt for her through every city until he drives her back to hell once more, whence envy first unleashed her on mankind. And so, I think it best you follow me for your own good, and I shall be your guide and lead you out through an eternal place, where you will hear desperate cries, and see tormented shades, some old as hell itself, and know what second death is from their screams. And later you will see those who rejoice while they are burning, for they have hope of coming, whenever it be, to join the blessed. To whom, if you wish to make the climb, a spirit worthier than I must take you. I shall go back, leaving you in her care. Because that emperor dwelling on high will not let me lead any to his city, since I in life rebelled against his law. Everywhere he reigns, and there he rules, there is his city. There is his high throne, oh happy, the one he makes his citizen. And I to him, poet, I beg of you, in the name of God, that God you never knew, save me from this evil place and worse. Lead me there to the place you spoke about, that I may see the gate St. Peter guards, and those whose anguish you have told me of. Then he moved on, and I moved close behind him. That is Canto I. So, I guess I'll just kind of run through things of interest in that canto. It starts off with midway through the journey of our life. The hour in there is pretty significant. If you ever kind of start to break down the poem, that usually is the first thing, and you can speak for a long time about what that means. Midway through the journey of our life, the use of that word is pretty significant. It's implied, though this is literally the only implication anywhere ever about Dante's age. We don't actually know. Record keeping wasn't that great at the time, but it's implied that at the time of this journey he was 35 years old, because there's a verse in the Bible that says that each man is owed 70 years, so 70 years. So when he says midway along the journey of his life, a lot of people read that to be specifically that he's 35 years old at this time, for whatever that's worth, whether or not that actually matters. It's also important to recognize that this poem makes a lot of truth claims, in the sense that it does not supposed to be a fiction, it does not suppose to be a dream. It supposes that this is a true story of an event that took place in the pilgrim's life. This is a poem of metamorphosis, in the sense that it is written from two perspectives simultaneously, one of the pilgrim and one of the poet, and the conceit of Dante's work is that over the course of the work, the pilgrim becomes the poet, right? That's the whole idea, is that it's a metamorphosis from the pilgrim to the poet. There's a lot of little notes in here that I could break down, and I'll probably run through them fairly quickly. Specifically, there's references in this canto that actually date this poem quite accurately, like shockingly accurately. This poem takes place, it starts on Good Friday in the year 1300, and that date actually matters quite a lot. Specifically 1300 because a lot of the characters in this story will make prophecies about things that will come to pass. And it turns out that because it was written in like 1308 or 1315 or 1321 or whatever the case may be, that these prophecies are things that the poet already knew to be true. But from the perspective of the year 1300, it was not known to be true at the time. So it was a prophecy at that point. A few little things. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds on this. I don't think it's worthwhile. We came across 3 beasts in that first canto. The first was the leopard with the gaudy pelt. The second was the lion, furious. The air seemed to fear his presence. And the third was the she-wolf that was racked with every kind of greediness. This actually breaks down into the Aristotelian 3 types of sins, the 3 types of faults in a man. The first one would be pride, the second would be avarice, and the third would be incontinence. There's also other ways to view those beasts. You can, a lot of commentary tradition breaks them down in a number of really interesting ways. There's a supposition that the lion represents France because the heraldry of the King of France at the time was a lion. The lion represented France. That the leopard resented Florence. And that the she-wolf represented the papacy. And you can kind of reread Canto I with that thought process. And it kind of makes sense, the context, but it's perhaps reading a little too much. It's also important to remember, this poem is not an example of starting in median res. That's a term that's used for starting in the middle of things. The reason why it's not considered to be an example of in median res is because in median res demands that we be able to kind of look back on the road that led us to this point, and explicitly in the poem, the pilgrim cannot recall how he reached this point. And so it is truly meant to be him dropped into an unfamiliar world with no recollection of how he reached here. It's just not an example of classical in median res. There's going to be a lot of examples of this throughout Inferno where people introduce themselves not by name but by sort of an account of them. This is a term known as periphrasis, where it's kind. I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's kind of a means of getting readers at the time to show off how smart they were. Like, I'm not going to tell you that I'm Virgil, but what I will say is that I'm no longer a man. My parents were from Lombard, both of them Mantuans by birth. I was born under Augustus Caesar, lived in Rome. I wrote about the son of Anachyses, right? Like, he never once says, I am Virgil. He describes, like, an account of himself, and it's, for lack of a better way of putting it, really just a way that medieval authors and medieval readers kind of flexed their knowledge. They were just like, hey, if you recognize all these things together, if you figured out who this is, then you are very smart, and please enjoy your smartness. Though it is worth mentioning really quickly that Virgil very quickly makes it clear that he is not always trustworthy. A lot of what he said was not exactly accurate in here. For instance, he says that his parents were both from Lombard. They were not from Lombard. They were from the neighboring regions of Lombard. It would be like if you were, if you grew up in New Jersey, right across the river, and you said that you were from New York City, right? Like it's, you're not way off the mark, but you're not being perfectly honest. And when he said that he was born sub Iulio under Augustus Caesar, he wasn't really born under Augustus Caesar. He wasn't alive at the right time for that. So in general, a perhaps more clever reading here is that Virgil is not going to always be reliable. A lot of commentary tradition says that Virgil represents sort of common sense or reason. He's supposed to represent like the rational mind against the poet's sort of emotional response to what he sees around him. But I don't know that I necessarily buy that either. I don't think that that's a very accurate reading, and is not necessarily the prevailing analysis these days either. But just kind of interesting. Interesting to point out. Other little things here, I guess. Virgil does give us a really quick glimpse into everything that we're going to see. He describes hell, purgatory, and paradise all at once, which is kind of nice. I guess I didn't mention, but when he said son of Anchises, he was talking about Aeneas. In the story of the Aeneid, Aeneid's father is Anchises. So he doesn't even say, I wrote the story of Aeneas. He said, I wrote the story of the son of Anchises, which is like another layer he adds on top of it. I just think it's interesting. Alright. Canto II. The day was fading, and the darkening air was releasing all the creatures on our earth from their daily tasks, and I, one man alone, was making ready to endure the battle of the journey, and of the pity involved, which my memory, unerring, shall now retrace. O Muses, O high genius, help me now. O memory that wrote down what I saw, here your true excellence shall be revealed. Then I began, O poet, come to guide me. Tell me if you think my worth is sufficient before you trust me to this arduous road. You wrote about young Silvius' father, who went beyond, with flesh corruptible, with all his senses to the immortal realm. But if the adversary of all evil was kind to him, considering who he was, and the consequence that was to come to him, this cannot seem, to thoughtful men, unfitting. From the highest heaven he was chose father of glorious Rome and of her empire. And both the city and her lands, in truth, were established as the place of holiness, where the successors of great Peter sit. And from this journey, you celebrate in verse. Aeneas learned those things that were to bring victory for him, and for Rome, the papal seat. Then later, the chosen vessel Paul ascended to bring back confirmation of that faith, which is the first step on salvation's road. But why am I to go? Who allows me to? I am not Aeneas. I am not Paul. Neither I nor any man would think me worthy, and so, if I should undertake the journey, I fear it might turn out an act of folly. You are wise. You see more than my words express. As one who unwills what he willed, will change his purpose with some new second thought, completely quitting what he first had started. So I did, standing there on that dark slope, thinking, ending the beginning of that venture I was so quick to take up at the start. If I have truly understood your words, that shade of magnanimity replied, your soul is burdened with that cowardice which often weighs so heavily on man. It turns him from noble enterprise like a frightened beast that shies at its own shadow. To free you from this fear, let me explain the reason I came here. The words I heard that first time I felt pity for your soul. I was among those dead who are suspended when a lady summoned me. She was so blessed and beautiful, I implored her to command me. With eyes of light more bright than any star, in low, soft tones she started to address me in her own language with an angel's voice. O noble soul, courteous Mantuan, whose fame the world continues to preserve and will preserve as long as world there is, my friend, who is no friend of fortune's, strays on a desert slope. So many obstacles have crossed his path. His fright has turned him back. I fear he may have gone so far astray from what report has come to me in heaven, that I may have started to his aid too late. Now go, and with your elegance of speech, with whatever may be needed for his freedom, give him your help, and thereby bring me solace. I am Beatrice, who urges you to go. I come from the place I am longing to return to. Love moved me, as it moves me now to speak. When I return to stand before my Lord, often I shall sing your praises to him. And then she spoke no more. And I began, O Lady of Grace, through whom alone mankind may go beyond all worldly things contained within the sphere that makes the smallest round. Your plea fills me with happy eagerness. To have obeyed already would still seem too late. You needed only to express your wish. But tell me how you dared to make this journey all the way down to this point of spacelessness, away from your spacious home that calls you back. Because your question searches for deep meaning, I shall explain in simple words, she said. Just why I have no fear coming here. A man must stand in fear of those things that truly have the power to do us harm. Of nothing else, for nothing else is fearsome. God gave me such a nature through his grace, the torments you must bear cannot affect me, nor are the fires of hell a threat to me. A gracious lady sits in heaven grieving for what happened to the one I send to you, and her compassion breaks heaven's stern decree. She called Lucia, and making her request, she said, Your faithful one is now in need of you, and to you I now commend his soul. Lucia, the enemy of cruelty, hastened to make her way to where I was, sitting by the side of ancient Rachel, and said to me, Beatrice, God's true praise, will you not help the one whose love was such it made him leave the vulgar crowd for you? Do you not hear the pity of his weeping? Do you not see what death it is that threatens him along that river the sea shall never conquer? There was never a worldly person living more anxious to promote his selfish gains than I was at the sounds of words like these. To leave my holy seat and come down here and place my trust in you, in your noble speech that honors you and all those who have heard it. When she had finished reasoning, she turned her shining eyes away, and there were tears. How eager then I was to come to you. And I have come to you just as she wished, and I have freed you from the beast that stood blocking the quick way up the Mount of Bliss. So what is wrong? Why do you delay? Why are you such a coward in your heart? Why aren't you bold and free of all your fear, when three such gracious ladies, who are blessed, watch out for you up there in heaven's court, and my words too bring promise of such good? As little flowers from the frosty night are closed and limp, and when the sun shines down on them they rise to open on their stem, my wilted strength began to bloom within me, and such warm courage flowed into my heart that I spoke like a man set free of fear. O she, compassionate, who moved to help me, and you, all kindness and obeying, quick those words of truth she brought with her for you. You and the words you spoke have moved my heart with such desire to continue onward that now I have returned to my first purpose. Let us start, for both our wills, joined now, are one. You are my guide. You are my Lord and teacher. These were my words to him, and when he moved, I entered on that deep and rugged road. And that's Canto II. There's actually a ton to say about Canto II, but I'm going to not say a lot of those things, because some of this really gets in the weeds. The broad stroke explanation for a lot of what's going on in here, this is a, this passage, Canto II, is really, in a sense, sort of a rhetorical spar between Dante and Virgil. It is a polite argument that they are having with one another. And throughout it, each one sort of gets the upper hand in different ways. Dante begins by mentioning a few specific people. He mentions Aeneas, who had a successful journey, though you must not have read all of the Aeneid to believe he had a successful journey. And then later he talks about Paul, who in 2 Corinthians 12, I believe it is, writes of a vision, though I guess in Paul's words it's not a vision. He actually goes to the third heaven in order to... I mean, he gets a chance to witness a part of heaven, essentially. And so both of these characters who are sort of taking a trip to witness something beyond themselves, both kind of model the same sort of journey that Dante is planning to undertake, and so his words are essentially like, why would I be worthy? I mean, these people have done this before, and they are great, and I am not. Why would I be worthy to do such a thing? And so Virgil attempts to convince him by explaining to him that it wasn't actually Virgil's idea in the first place. It was Beatrice, who was ordered by Lucia, who was ordered by, and in the end it turns out, the Virgin Mary, to help Dante, to help him safely escape the troubles that he was in. Virgil's one of the world's greatest simps. I love his line in here. Your plea fills me with happy eagerness. To have obeyed already would still seem too late. I just think that's good. There's a few other things in here that are maybe interesting to mention. I'm kind of brushing past a few things, but like, for instance, Beatrice, she mentions that the fire of hell is not a threat to her, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of ways to interpret that. You could say that... So, for those of you who don't know where we're going with this, hell is not filled with fire in Dante's writing. Hell is filled with ice. It is allegorically the separation from the warmth of God's love that makes hell such a cold place. And there's only a few spots in the entirety of hell that have fire at all. There's like the false counselors in Circle 8. There's I think the fires in the heretics. There's in Circle 6 there's fire. The river of blood is boiling, but that's not really fire. There's some like ashes or cinders raining down in Circle 7. But like broadly, hell would be characterized as being cold rather than hot in Dante's work. And so there's a few ways to interpret this. It's either Dante wrote this before he had kind of finished the whole plan. It's kind of important to remember as you read comedy that it's a poem in process is the term that so a lot of what I'm saying is cribbed from Mark Scarborough. I've read a lot of work and I've listened to him talk about this a lot, but the phrase he uses is poem in process. It wasn't like sat down and planned out. It was kind of all written front to back. So it's possible that Dante had not yet envisioned hell being a cold place, but rather envisioned it being hot. But if you accept a certain amount of, okay, Dante knows what he's doing, he knows what the plan is, it's also possible to interpret this as, why would Beatrice know what hell contains? Why would she care? Pointedly throughout comedy, what we learn is that the damned are concerned about what the damned are doing, and the damned are concerned about what the living are doing, and the damned are concerned with what the blessed are doing. But the blessed only care about God. The goings-on of hell, the goings-on of the world are inconsequential to them. So it's possible that Beatrice just doesn't know that hell contains ice, that she imagines it to be a fiery place. Which I think is kind of an interesting way to interpret that. There's a lot of allegory here that makes more sense if you're kind of familiar with more classical references, things like Lucius sitting next to the ancient Rachel. Rachel is a figure in, Beatrice sitting next to Rachel. Rachel is a figure in contemporary thought to represent the contemplative life. So the life of one who isn't constantly active, but one who is more focused on thoughtful mindfulness, things like that. And so there's a connection there that she's sitting with Beatrice, things like that. I think that's all I'll say about this. There's a lot of really interesting ways to look at Canto II as being sort of a battle of rhetoric between first Dante and Virgil, and then between Virgil and Beatrice, and then back to between Dante and Virgil again. Ultimately, Virgil kind of flexes his muscles and ends up winning the rhetorical battle between him and Beatrice. I'm not really sure if there's a result for his battle with Dante, but the battle rages on for what it's worth. So, Canto III. I am the way into the doleful city. I am the way into eternal grief. I am the way to a forsaken race. Justice it was that moved my great Creator. Divine omnipotence created me, and highest wisdom joined with primal love. Before me nothing but eternal things were made, and I shall last eternally. Abandon every hope, all you who enter. I saw these words spelled out in somber colors, inscribed along the ledge above a gate. Master, I said, these words I see are cruel. He answered me, speaking with experience, Now here you must leave all distrust behind. Let all your cowardice die on this spot. We are at the place where earlier I said you could expect to see the suffering race of souls who lost the good of intellect. Placing his hand on mine, smiling at me in such a way I was reassured, he led me into those mysteries. Here sighs and cries and shrieks of lamentation echoed throughout the starless air of hell. At first these sounds, resounding, made me weep. Tongues confused, a language strained in anguish with cadences of anger, shrill outcries and raucous groans that joined with the sound of hands, raising a whirling storm that turns itself forever through that air of endless black, like grains of sand swirling with a whirlwind blows. And I, in the midst of all this circling horror, began, Teacher, what are those sounds I hear? What souls are these so overwhelmed by grief? And he to me, This wretched state of being is the fate of those sad souls who lived a life, but lived it with no blame and with no praise. They are mixed with that repulsive choir of angels, neither faithful nor unfaithful to their God, who undecided stood but for themselves. Heaven, to keep its beauty, cast them out, but even hell itself would not receive them, for fear the damned might glory over them. And I, Master, what torments do they suffer that force them to lament so bitterly? He answered, I will tell you in a few words. These wretches have no hope of truly dying. And this blind life they lead is so abject it makes them envy every other fate. The world will not record their having been there. Heaven's mercy and its justice turn from them. Let's not discuss them. Look and pass them by. And so I looked and saw a kind of banner rushing ahead, whirling with aimless speed as though it would not ever take a stand. Behind it, an interminable train of souls pressed on, so many that I wondered how death could have undone so great a number. When I had recognized a few of them, I saw the shade of the one who must have been the coward who made the great refusal. At once I understood, and I was sure this was a sect of evil souls who were so hateful to God and to his enemies. These wretches, who had never truly lived, went naked, and were stung, and stung again by the hornets and the wasps that circled them, and made their faces run with blood in streaks. Their blood, mixed with their tears, dripped to their feet, and disgusting maggots collected in the pus. When I looked beyond this crowd, I saw a throng upon the shore of a wide river, which made me ask, Master, I would like to know, who are these people, and what law is this that makes these souls so eager for the crossing, as I can see even in this dim light? And he, all this will be made plain to you as soon as we shall come to stop a while among the sorrowful shore of the Acheron. And I, with eyes cast down in shame for fear that I perhaps had spoken out of turn, said nothing more until we reached the river. And suddenly, coming toward us in a boat, a man of years whose ancient hair was white shouted at us, Woe to you, perverted souls! Give up all hope of ever seeing heaven. I come to lead you to the other shore, into eternal darkness, ice, and fire. And you, the living soul, you over there, get away from all these people who are dead. But when he saw I did not move aside, he said, Another way, by other ports, not here, shall you pass to reach the other shore. A lighter skiff than this must carry you. And my guide, Charon, this is no time for anger. It is so willed. There where power is for what is willed, that's all you need to know. These words brought silence to the woolly cheeks of the ancient steersman in the livid marsh, whose eyes were set in glowing wheels of fire. But all those souls there, naked, in despair, changed color, and their teeth began to chatter at the sound of his announcement of their doom. They were cursing God, cursing their own parents, the human race, the time, the place, the seed of their beginning, and their day of birth. Then all together, weeping bitterly, they packed themselves along the wicked shore that waits for every man who fears not God. The devil, Charon, with eyes of glowing coals, summons them all together with a signal, and with an oar he strikes the laggard sinner. As in autumn, when the leaves begin to fall one after the other, until the branch is witness to the spoils spread on the ground, so did the seed of Adam's fall drop from that shore to the boat, one at a time, at the signal, like the falcon to its lure. Away they go across the darkened waters, and before they reach the other side to land, a new throng starts collecting on this side. My son, the gentle master said to me, all those who perish in the wrath of God assemble here from all parts of the earth. They want to cross this river. They are eager. It is divine justice that spurs them on, turning the fear they have into desire. A good soul never comes to make this crossing. So, if Charon grumbles at the sight of you, you see now what his words are really saying. He finished speaking, and the grim terrain shook violently, and the fright it gave me, even now in recollection, makes me sweat. Out of the tear-drenched land a wind arose, which blasted forth into a reddish light, knocking my senses out of me completely, and I fell as one falls tired into sleep. It's Canto Iii. So, this chapter starts with the sort of pronouncement by the gate of its own design. So, describes its own purpose, the causes by which it was created, and sort of references in antiquity that would describe the gate. So, I am the way into the doleful city. I am the way into an eternal grief. I am the way to a forsaken race. So, that describes what purpose the gate serves. And it's kind of a civic duty, so there's, I think it's easy to forget that hell is divided almost like a city, like a giant thriving metropolis. That viewpoint is kind of helpful. It is not just this barren wasteland, but it is set up in almost a civic sense. It said again, justice was that justice it was that moved my great creator. Kind of an interesting way of writing that, because God is meant to be the great mover and is himself unmoved. So the fact that justice it was that moved my great creator is fascinating on its own. And it says, before me nothing but eternal things were made, and I shall last eternally. Which does match up with orthodoxy, that hell was one of the first creations. He says that you can expect to see a suffering race of souls who lost the good of intellect. A lot of the repeating theme throughout Inferno is that the real sin that occurs in every single situation is that God gives man intellect, and that man uses that intellect for the wrong purpose. Uses it for wrong things, right? The value of intellect is to uplift the self and to uplift others, and this represents sort of man using intellect to serve only himself and bring himself down in the way. This is actually the only place in all of hell that has angels, like fallen angels. They're represented from the story of the battle in hell of Lucifer rebelling, and the angels who chose not to take a side were sent here in the process. This is the only place in all of hell where we encounter angels, period. Which is, I guess, noteworthy on its own. This is the realm of the neutrals, the indecisive, perhaps is another way to put it. People who chose not to stand for anything in their lives, and their punishment is to remain nameless. This is... So, arguably, Dante did not come up with the idea of contrapasso this early in Inferno. For those of you who aren't familiar, the term contrapasso comes from... basically the idea of it's built from Italian stems for suffer the opposite, essentially. So you sin in one way in life, and you are punished similarly or by the opposite of it in hell. And there's a lot of examples of that in Inferno, and actually a lot of examples of that in Purgatory as well. But Dante arguably doesn't really come up with that this early in Inferno. There's a lot of situations in which it's hard to draw a line for what the actual punishment is and why that connects to their sin. But you could argue easily that this is a good example of contrapasso here, where they did not stand for anything in life, and so they lose their identity in death. Virgil makes a key point of not giving them a name, not naming them, which Dante immediately screws up and tries to start identifying people out loud. He immediately starts saying, oh, I recognize this guy, and I recognize this guy, and I recognize this guy, right after Virgil says, hey dude, let's not talk about these people. So their other punishment in hell is constantly following a banner like a banner that would be held up during battle to help you identify where your side is. They're following a banner that's just kind of not going in any particular direction. It's just running around aimlessly, and as they chase it, they're being stung by wasps and chewed on by bugs, and you know, their blood and the pus is being eaten by maggots. It's kind of a grotesque... I mean, it's meant to be grotesque. That's the whole idea of it. In terms of people that Dante identifies, he points out a few people, but specifically, he mentions the coward who made the great refusal. This is kind of a famous instance in Inferno of circumlocution, where where he doesn't say directly who he's talking about. He uses language to expect the reader to figure out who he's talking about. But interestingly here, the poet uses circumlocution in a really bad way. It's not clear who he's talking about. In fact, a lot of the commentary tradition has spent, roughly the last 700 years trying to identify who this is. There's a few names that have come up many different times. The most common example here is people equate this to being Pontius Pilate, who made the great refusal to, protect Jesus. That's who most people equate it to. Let me check the notes. They mention a few other people in here. I lean toward Pontius Pilate because that makes sense to me. But there's other examples. There's let's see. There's the Emperor Diocletian, who in his old age abdicated the throne. There's Esau, who relinquished his rights of fatherhood to Jacob. Vieri de Cerci, who was the head of the Florentine Whites, who was incompetent and didn't relinquish his seat. Frederick II. Most critics believe that it is Celestine V, who renounced the papacy in 1294, 5 months after being elected. Celestine V considered himself not to be up to the task of being the Pope, and so he resigned out of humility. And it's typically considered to be a pious act that he performed. It's not usually considered to be a sign of cowardice. So it's unlikely that Dante would have picked him to be, would have pointed at him as a coward, because as far as the church is concerned, the sort of orthodoxical view on it is that it was a really honorable thing that he did. So, I mean, pick your favorite, right? Pick your favorite person. Who cares? It's kind of useful that we're able to do that, because the whole idea was that Dante wasn't supposed to identify anyone, and arguably he didn't. He did a really shitty job identifying anyone. A few other things I'll point out. Charon is a character from classical mythology. We will see a lot of characters from classical mythology here in Inferno. This is not the exception. This is the rule. We will see a ton of them. And sometimes the lines get really, really crossed. One of the common themes, however, is that by putting classical characters from mythology into all of comedy, they appear at every single level, all the way up to paradise. It is a sort of tacit way of saying that the Christian God has dominion over even them, like sort of like further purporting the truth claims of God. I don't know a better way to put that. Other little things in here. One thing that we're gonna run into like 100 times throughout Inferno, it's just gonna keep happening. It happens actually even more in Purgatory, but it'll come up a ton in Inferno. Is figuring out how does Dante's corporeality as a living person in hell work, right? Like, everyone else is a shade. Effectively a ghost, if you want to put it that way, if that's easier for you. But a shade. They have no weight, they have no mass, they have no anything, right? You can move your hand right through them. But, like, Dante's a real dude. Like, he's a real guy in here. And Dante doesn't play around with that. Like, it's not like, well, maybe he's incorporeal while he's in hell. No, he's like a full guy. Like, he's a full guy. He's like he's a real man. But this early in Inferno, I don't think Dante had really worked out how to make that work. And so the first place where this really comes up, that Dante just kind of punts on it and says, not my problem, I'll figure it out later, is when he has to cross the Acheron, the river. He climbs into Charon's boat, right? And Charon even says himself, this boat is not meant for living beings, right? It is not a boat that is sturdy enough. In fact, he even says, Another way by other ports not here shall you pass to reach the other shore. A lighter skiff than this must carry you. He's actually referring to Purgatory when he says that, because in Purgatory there is a different boat that takes them to the base of Mount Purgatory. But Dante, like, I guess does decide not to figure out how to deal with the fact that the pilgrim has weight, and so just makes him pass out as soon as he gets in the boat. And we'll see at the beginning of the next canto, he just wakes up on the other side. Like, not my problem, I'll figure it out later. He just passes out. This is actually one of, I think, 2 or 3 times in Inferno that the pilgrim passes out. It's also kind of important to understand the timeline. He makes this entire trip in 3 days. 1 whole day of which is him being lost in the dark wood at the very beginning. So he spends only 2 days walking through the entirety of hell, which is pretty impressive. Which also means that he doesn't ever sleep, and the only quote-unquote sleep he ever gets is the few times he passes out. Alright. Canto IV. A heavy clap of thunder. I awoke from the deep sleep that drugged my mind, startled the way one is when shaken out of sleep. I turned my rested eyes from side to side, already on my feet and staring hard. I tried my best to find out where I was. And this is what I saw. I found myself upon the brink of grief's abysmal valley that collects the thunderings of endless cries. So dark and deep and nebulous it was. Try as I might to force my sight below, I could not see the shape of anything. Let us descend into the sightless world, began the poet. His face was deathly pale. I will go first, and you will follow me. And I, aware of his changed color, said, but how can I go on if you are frightened? You are my constant strength when I lose heart. And he to me, the anguish of the souls that are down here paints my face with pity, which you have wrongly taken to be fear. Let us go, the long road urges us. He entered then, leading way for me down to the first circle of the abyss. Down there, to judge only by what I heard, there were no wails, but just the sounds of sighs, rising and trembling through the timeless air, the sounds of sighs of untormented grief burdening these groups, diverse and teeming, made up of men and women and of infants. Then the good master said, you do not ask what sort of souls are these that you see around you. Now you should know, before we go on farther. They have not sinned. But their great worth alone was not enough, for they did not know baptism, which is the gateway to the faith you follow. And if they came before the birth of Christ, they did not worship God the way one should. I myself am a member of this group. For this defect, and for no other guilt, we here are lost. In this alone we suffer. Cut off from hope, we live on in desire. These words I heard weighed heavy on my heart, to think that souls as virtuous as these were suspended in that limbo, and forever. Tell me, my teacher, tell me, oh my master, I began, wishing to have confirmed by him the teachings of unerring Christian doctrine. Did any ever leave here, through his merit or with another's help, and go to bliss? And he, who understood my hidden question, answered, I was a novice in this place. When I saw the mighty Lord descend to us, who wore the sign of victory as his crown, he took from us the shade of our first parent, of Abel, his good son, of Noah too, and of obedient Moses, who made the laws. Abram, the patriarch, David, the king, Israel with his father and his children, with Rachel, whom he worked so hard to win, and many more he chose for blessedness. And you should know, before these souls were taken, no human soul had ever reached salvation. We did not stop our journey while he spoke, but continued on our way along the woods. I say the woods, for souls were thick as trees. We had not gone too far from where I woke when I first made out a fire up ahead, a hemisphere of light that lit the dark. We were still at some distance from that place, but close enough for me vaguely to see that honorable souls possessed that spot. Oh, glory of the sciences and arts! Who are these souls enjoying special honor, dwelling apart from all the others here? And he to me, the honored name they bear that still resounds above in your own world wins heaven's favor for them in this place. And as he spoke, I heard a voice announce, "Now let us honor our illustrious poet. His shade that left is now returned to us." And when the voice was silent and all was quiet, I saw 4 mighty shades approaching us, their faces showing neither joy nor sorrow. Then my good master started to explain, "Observe the one who comes with sword in hand, leading the 3 as if he were their master. It is the shade of Homer, sovereign poet. And coming second, Horace, the satirist. Ovid is the third, and the last comes Lucian. Since they all share one name with me, the name you heard resounding in that single voice, they honor me and do well doing so. So I gathered there the noble school of the master singer of sublimest verse, who soars above all others like the eagle. And after they had talked a while together, they turned and with a gesture welcomed me, and at that sign I saw my master smile. Greater honor they still deigned to grant me. They welcomed me as one of their own, so that I numbered 6th among such minds. We walked together toward the shining light, discussing things that here are best kept silent, as they were most fitting for discussion. We reached the boundaries of a splendid castle that 7 times was circled by high walls, defended by a sweetly flowing stream. We walked right over it, as on hard ground. Through 7 gates I passed with those wise spirits, and then we reached a meadow fresh in bloom. There people were whose eyes were calm and grave. Those bearing told of great authority. Seldom they spoke, and always quietly. Then moving to one side, we reached a place spread out and luminous, higher than before, allowing us to view all who were there. And right before us, on the illustrious green, the mighty shades were pointed out to me. My heart felt glory when I looked at them. There was Electra standing with a group, among whom I saw Hector and Aeneas, and Caesar, falcon-eyed and fully armed. I saw Camilla and Penthelesia. Across the way I saw the Latian king, with Lavinia his daughter by his side. I saw the Brutus, who drove out the Tarquin, Lucretia, Julia, Marcia, and Cornelia. Off by himself I noticed Saladin. And when I raised my eyes a little higher, I saw the master sage of those who know, sitting with his philosophic family. All gazed at him, all paid their homage to him, and there I saw both Socrates and Plato, each closer to his side than any other. Democritus, who said the world was chance, Diogenes, Thales, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Zeno, and Heraclitus. I saw the one who classified our herbs, Discordes, and I saw Orpheus, Tully, Linus, and Seneca the moralist, Euclid the geometer and Ptolemy, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and Averroes, who made the commentary. I cannot tell about them all in full. My theme is long and urges me ahead. Often I must omit things I have seen. The company of 6 becomes 2. My wise guide leads me by another way, out of the quiet into tempestuous air. I came into a plate where no light is. So that was Limbo. Limbo is the home of the virtuous pagans. It's somewhat heterodoxical, the way that it's presented here. It doesn't really match the teachings of the church. I believe, so Purgatory and Limbo are both creations of the church around this time, part of medieval thought. And they both serve separate purposes. They aren't necessarily spoken of in the Bible, but they serve separate purposes for the church. So, for instance, purgatory served as a way for people who it sort of served as a way first for people to have an explanation of how sins were purgated, in order to not make it quite so black and white for who gets into heaven and hell. And in the long run ended up becoming sort of a way for them to sell indulgences. So that is neither here nor there. Limbo is also a creation of the church. Orthodoxy describes it as a home for virtuous pagans. Essentially, it's an answer to the question of what happened first to all the people from the Old Testament who didn't sin, who believed in God, who loved him with all their heart, but didn't receive the baptism. Like, what do you do with those people? And then second, what do you do with children who pass away before they can be baptized, before they can accept the word of God? And so limbo served a lot of purposes. And in true orthodoxy, there's a lot of different limbos. It's not just one limbo. It breaks down into various ones. There's the limbo of the fathers, which is the limbo that contained all of the Old Testament characters that you know. And then there were several others. I don't remember exactly how it breaks down. But the story of the harrowing of hell, which is arguably apocryphal, arguably directly from the Bible. It kind of goes both ways. But the story of the harrowing of hell is when Jesus was crucified. During that time that he was dead for a few days, he actually went to hell and basically rocked that place and freed the Old Testament characters and brought them into paradise. That's the whole theme of the harrowing of hell, is that Jesus actually went down into hell, opened the limbo of the fathers, and brought everyone out of it into paradise. He obviously didn't free everyone from limbo, but specifically the limbo of the fathers was emptied. A few things to note here is that a lot of people who talk about Inferno like to say that hell doesn't start till after here, because the people who are in limbo aren't really suffering any punishment. First off, they are suffering a punishment. At least according to Christian thought, being separated from the love and warmth of God is itself a punishment. Whether they are being whether or not you feel like the fact that just because they're not being flayed alive means that they're not being punished, they are being punished. Second, if you believe that hell doesn't start till after limbo, that doesn't really explain what's happening in the vestibule, the neutrals, who are definitely being punished. They are definitely experiencing a punishment, so that doesn't make any sense. In any case, yeah. Limbo is definitely a part of hell. That's the big takeaway. And it's almost, if you think about it, a punishment more for everyone else than it is for the people in limbo, because as we're going to see pretty soon, the way that souls come into hell, we've already seen a few of them in transit, but they travel down the layers, right? They travel through the vestibule, they travel through limbo, so they get to see this beautiful verdant fields, green pastures, well-lit areas, beautiful streams of people sitting and talking to one another, beautiful castles, and just this gorgeous place, and they're being like walked right through it, so that kind of sucks. Yes, limbo and purgatory are two different things. Though, what I was saying before was that the orthodoxical approach to limbo was always that limbo was a part of purgatory. It was like the base of purgatory that you never leave. That's not the way Dante envisions it, but that's the way the church envisioned it. In Dante's vision, he separates them completely. But if I'm not mistaken, in orthodoxical thought at the time, limbo was a part of purgatory. You just never really got the opportunity to purgate. Because what are you gonna purgate, right? Other things. Dante's pretty high on himself, considering he writes this self-insert fanfic in Limbo where he encounters 4 great authors being guided by a 5th and says that they counted him as a 6th. I mean, it takes huge balls to be kind of a no-name poet at the time and say, yeah, I'm pretty great, and these guys, they met me for like 10 minutes, and they counted me among their own. Those words, they honored me and did well to do so, were Virgil's words specifically. But Dante picks up right from there and says, I'm pretty great too. So, there's a lot of analysis you can do about whether or not there's meaning to the ordering of some of these people. It is very specific in the way that Homer is the first, Horace, the satirist, is the second, Ovid is the third, and the last is Lucian. By the way, in medieval thought, Horace would be considered to be a satirist. That's just the way he was viewed, but these days we don't really think of him by his satire. We think of him more for his elegies, so I mean, you know, if this were to be modernized, we would refer to him as an elegiast. But at the time, what he was really well known for was his satire. And so there's perhaps meaning for him being counted 6th among them. Dante was really big on numerology, things like 100, Cantos, 33, 33 per book in 3 different books. 3 is a constantly repeating theme, so much so that it's very hard not to think that it's intentional the way that those numbers show up sometimes. Like, for instance, in the previous chapter, Dante makes a direct address to the, he makes a direct, not address to the reader, he makes a direct, address, like he's like, oh, muses, oh, high art. He makes exactly 9 of those over the course of comedy. Is it happenstance he makes exactly 9 of those? I mean, maybe for any other author, but Dante's like real big on numerology and the number and what they represent and the meanings behind them. So 9 is 3 times 3. I mean, that's pretty Dantean. Let's see. I mean, I could go through a lot of who these characters were if you weren't familiar with a lot of the names that came up. Specifically, I think the most interesting ones to talk about is that he mentions Saladin, which is a Muslim, and Averroes, which is, I think, the name that the Western world gave to Ibn Rushd, who wrote a commentary on Aristotle. By the way, Aristotle was mentioned. He was just mentioned paraphrastically. He was mentioned, let's see, where was it? Said, I saw the master sage of those who know. That's Aristotle, sitting with his philosophic family. A lot of these characters are ones that medieval readers at the time would be very familiar with their writings and would recognize these names and would marvel at all of the people being mentioned here in Limbo. It doesn't necessarily matter whether or not you know them specifically, but, you know. There's a lot of name drops throughout comedy. A lot of this is kind of a who's who of people. Anyway, that is Limbo. There's a lot to say about Limbo that I'm just gonna skip. Things like, why were there 7 gates to the castle in Limbo? That has to do with the way the medievals saw thought breakdown to things like the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, plus the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. Those are the ways that thought are broken down into 3 and 4, which if you add them together, you get 7. Why was Dante able to walk across water? I'll leave that one to you to think about, because I don't have a good answer. Oh, also, early on, Dante says, "How can I go on if you are frightened? You are my constant strength when I lose heart." And to him, Virgil replies, "The anguish of the souls that are down here paints my face with pity, which you have wrongly taken to be fear." That's probably a lie. First off, the poet Virgil is pretty clear about the fact that you should not take pity on the damned, ever. And so for him to just like immediately say, "I feel pitied," is probably just him lying. He's probably actually scared because he's returning to the place that to his home in hell, right? Like, he was taken out of Limbo to perform this journey, and it is probably a harrowing experience to kind of like walk through your own home in that way. Anyway, Canto Iv, the home of the Lustful. This way I went, descending from the first into the second round that holds less space but much more pain, stinging the soul to wailing. There stands Minos grotesquely, and he snarls, examining the guilty at the entrance. He judges and dispatches, tail in coils. By this I mean that when the evil soul appears before him, it confesses all, and he, who is the expert judge of sins, knows to what place in hell the soul belongs. The times he wraps his tail around himself tell just how far the sinner must go down. The damned keep crowding up in front of him. They pass along to judgment one by one. They speak, they hear, and then are hurled below. "O you who come to the place where pain is host," Minos spoke out when he caught sight of me, putting aside the duties of his office. "Be careful how you enter, and whom you trust. It is easy to get in, but don't be fooled." And my guide to him, "Why keep on shouting? Do not attempt to stop this fated journey. It is so willed there where the power is for what is willed. That is all you need to know." And now the notes of anguish start to play upon my ears, and I now find myself where sounds on sounds of weeping pound at me. I came to a place where no light shone at all, bellowing like the sea racked by a tempest, when warring winds attack it from both sides. The infernal storm, eternal in its rage, sweeps and drives the spirits with its blast. It whirls them, lashing them with a punishment. When they are swept back to their place of judgment, then come the shrieks, laments, and anguished cries. There they blaspheme God's almighty power. I learn that to this place of punishment all those who sin in lust have been condemned, those who make reason slave to appetite. And as the wings of starlings in winter bear them along in widespread, crowded flocks, so does that wind propel the evil spirits. Now here, then there, and up and down it drives them, with never any hope to comfort them. Hope not of rest, but even of suffering less. And just like cranes in flight chanting their lays, stretching an endless line in their formation, I saw approaching, crying their laments, spirits carried along by the battling winds. And so I asked, "Teacher, tell me, what souls are these who punished in the sweep of the black wind?" The first of those whose story you should know, my master wasted no time in answering, was empress over lands of many tongues. Her vicious tastes had so corrupted her, she licensed every form of lust with laws to cleanse the stain of scandal she had spread. She is Ceremaeus, who legend says was Ninus' wife, as well as his successor. She governed all the lands the Sultan rules. Next is she who killed herself for love, and broke faith with the ashes of Sycius, and there is Cleopatra, who loved men's lusting. See Helen there, the root of evil woe lasting long years, and see the great Achilles who lost his life to love in final combat. See Paris, Tristan, then more than 1,000 he pointed out to me, and named them all, those shades whom love cut off from life on earth. After I heard my teacher call the names of all these knights and ladies of ancient times, pity confused my senses, and I was dazed. I began, "Poet, I would like with all of my heart to speak to those two who moved together and seemed to be so light upon the winds." And he, "You'll see them when they are closer to us. If you entreat them by that love of theirs that carries them along, they'll come to you." When the winds bent their course in our direction, I raised my voice to them, "O wearied souls, come speak with us if it be not forbidden." As doves, called by desire to return to their sweet nests with wings raised high and poised, float down through the air guided by will, so these two left the flock where Dido is, and came toward us through the malignant air. Such was the tender power of my call. O living creature, gracious and so kind, who makes your way here through this dingy air to visit us who stain the world with blood. If we could claim as friend the King of Kings, we would beseech him that he grant you peace, you who show pity for our atrocious plight. Whatever pleases you to hear or speak, we will hear and we will speak about with you, as long as the wind, here where we are, is silent. The place where I was born lies on the shore where the river Po with its attendant streams descends to seek its final resting place. Love, quick to kindle the gentle heart, seized this one for beauty of my body, torn from me. How it happened still offends me. Love, that excuses no one loved from loving, seized me so strongly with delight in him that, as you see, he never leaves my side. Love, led us straight to sudden death together. Caina awaits the one who quenched our lives. These were the words that came from them to us. When those offended souls had told their story, I bowed my head and kept it bowed until the poet said, "What are you thinking of?" When I finally spoke, I sighed. Alas, all those sweet thoughts, and oh, how much desiring brought these two down into this agony. And then I turned to them and tried to speak. I said, "Francesca, the torment that you suffer brings painful tears of pity to my eyes. But tell me, in that time of your sweet sighing, how and by what signs did love allow you to recognize your dubious desires?" And she to me, "There is no greater pain than to remember in our present grief past happiness, as well your teacher knows. But if your great desire is to learn the very root of such a love as ours, I shall tell you, but in words of flowing tears. One day we read, to pass the time, of Lancelot, of how he fell in love. We were alone, innocent of suspicion. Time and again our eyes were brought together by the book we read, our faces flushed and paled to the moment of one line alone we yielded. It was when we read about those longed-for lips now being kissed by such a famous lover, that this one, who shall never leave my side, then kissed my mouth, and trembled as he did. Our Galaho was that book, and he who wrote it. That day we read no further. And all the while the one of the two spirits spoke these words, the other wept, in such a way that pity blurred my senses. I swooned as though to die, and fell to hell's floor as a body dead falls. So this is the realm of the lustful, those whose great sin was a perversion of love. There's a lot of really interesting allegory in here, and you could spend a lot of time talking about whether or not Francesca should be admired or despised in here. So the punishment of the lustful are that they are forever tossed about in storm winds, because their passion. So this is again perhaps an overinterpretation, because the poet maybe hasn't yet gotten down exactly how contrapasso works at this point, but you could argue that the relationship here is that because those who succumb to lust have no power to control their own desires, so too in death do they have no power to control their motion through the storm. arguable. This chapter starts with us encountering Minos, the great judge, who coils his tail around himself a number of times and eventually thwacks the shade with his tail to send them down to whatever circle of hell they're meant to be. So the idea is that if he circles his tail around himself twice, then he will send them down to the second circle. If he circles his tail around himself 6 times, he will send them down to the 6th circle, whatever the case may be. Perhaps surprisingly, considering how much these shades of hell are known to lie and to misrepresent things, it is interesting that it says that they confess all of their sins before the expert judge of sins, as if they have a compulsion to do so. Like, why are they compelled to admit to all of their sins? It's kind of an interesting thought. Like, what is it about it that forces them to do so? There's a few observations you could make about it. Minos would not be able to send a soul up, right? Like, he's not going to send a soul up above him. You would have stopped in Limbo if you belonged in Limbo. So the minimum number of times that Minos can circle his tail around himself is 2 to send him down to the second hell. Also, it's perhaps worth pointing out that the presence of Minos after Limbo, like, the question is, why not have Minos appear before Limbo, right? Like, before Hell proper, why is Minos not responsible for sending souls to their correct place? And I think one argument that I've heard before that I like is that it doesn't make sense for Minos to appear before Limbo, since that's where the virtuous pagans go, and they would have had no concept of confession. They would have had no concept of what it means to, like, confess one's sins. Like, that is not an element of their ethos that they would be as familiar with. So perhaps that is why Dante put them after Limbo. Virgil spends quite a long time pointing out various people to him. It's kind of funny. The pilgrim asks, tell me what souls there are that are punished in the sweep of the black wind. The pilgrim already knows. The pilgrim already told us, like, the poet already told us before this, who was punished here. Like, by some means, Dante, the pilgrim, has figured it out by this point. But I think what he's wanting is names, right? He's looking for that sort of salacious information. He wants Virgil to tell him all the juicy details. And so he goes over some people, Semiramis, who was a woman who married her son. That was considered to be, at the time, that story would have been, the punishment there would have been just the perversion of it. There was also, let's see. Also there's a textual error in not the translation, but in the original text. This actually happens a lot in Inferno. Remember that Dante is in exile, right? Like, he's on the move all the time. He doesn't have, like, manuscripts he can look up information. He's reproducing a lot of these stories from memory. Quite impressive how many of these stories are just being recited from memory at any given time. But he messes some of them up sometimes. So, like, for instance, he says, she governed all the land the Sultan rules when talking about Semiramis. But that's not accurate. I think he's confusing her for someone else. Let me find the note. I want to remember who it is. I think he's confusing her with someone else who was married to a sultan that controls what we now consider to be Egypt and Syria. He actually, this happens a number of really noteworthy times in Inferno, where he will have a character appear in Inferno that is either the combination of multiple people who had similar names and he just got the stories mixed up, or he will get in a story entirely wrong. It actually happens enough times it's kind of interesting to point out when it happens, not like as a, wow, Dante's a real idiot, but more like, it's just kind of, it highlights the fact that this is a poem written in exile. When Francesca's talking, she mentions that Caina waits for the one who quenched our lives. So the story of Francesca goes that she was at home with her husband's brother, and supposedly, while reading the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which is a very similar story, right? Like, Lancelot and Guinevere got it on under the nose of King Arthur. While they were reading this story, they were kind of like driven in a fit of passion to make love to one another. The story goes that they were discovered by her husband, and both of them were killed on the spot. And so while they went to the realm of the Lustful for their sins, Francesca is saying, though she can't know, there's no way for her to know, but Francesca is claiming that Caina waits for the one who quenched our lives. Caina is a reference to one of the last circles of hell, the traitor to kin, people who are guilty of treachery or murder of people who are their family. And so that's just a reference to who killed them. One of the interesting things as you go through this story is the way that a lot of sinners, Francesca being the quintessential example of it, put a lot of energy into not taking credit or not being accountable to their sins. It's always someone else's fault. It's always something else caused this problem to happen. They had no power, right? This was random happenstance that they sinned, and it was not their responsibility. So things like love, quick to kindle in a gentle heart, seize this one for the beauty of my body torn from me, and love that excuses no one love from loving, and love who led us straight to sudden death together. And then down here she mentions Argalaho was that book and he who wrote it. Galaho is a reference to the character in the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Galaho was the messenger who was carrying messages to and from Lancelot and Guinevere, like their love letters to one another. So a Galaho would be sort of an interloper, like the thing that brings you together. And she says, Argalaho was that book and the one who wrote it. It wasn't our fault. The book led us to this. And so it's just kind of interesting. And you'll hear that if you pay close attention every time we meet a sinner in hell, with very few exceptions. There are some sinners in hell which are like, yeah, I did it, what of it? But for the most part, most of the sinners in hell are like, it's unfair that I'm here. I didn't really do anything wrong. I think that I'm misunderstood. And they really try to cast off the blame as much as possible. Yeah, of course. And that's exactly it, right? They spent their lives being concerned with themselves, and in death they are concerned with themselves all the same. That's kind of what it's all about. So that was the realm of the Lustful. Again, their punishment is being tossed about on this tumultuous wind, throwing them around. They have no power to control themselves, or rather limited power, because when Dante calls over Francesca and Paolo, they are able to come close and talk with them for a short time. But Desi, thank you so much for the raid. Congratulations. Welcome. We are reading Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Well, Epic, it's kind of interesting you point that out, because one thing that we're going to see is that the layering of hell is definitely in terms of the level of perversion, like the level of how much of a sin they committed, right? Like if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, what is the sin of lust? It's a sin of love. It's a sin of giving letting your intellect succumb to desire, right? That's what lust is in the end of the day. And it's letting your intellect succumb to your desire. And so in the grand scheme of things, it's punished the least because it's the least it's the sin that offends God the least is the idea. We're still in the realm of incontinence, so just kind of to talk about what those terms mean. Incontinence in Aristotelian thought was the idea of not protecting yourself against sin by using your intellect. So it's less about sort of active harm caused and more about just like not stopping yourself, right? Not taking control of your own desire, not taking control of your own passions. That's what incontinence is all about. Violence is about causing some harm to people with the use of intellect, and then fraud is purely using intellect to bring about someone else's ruin. So those are sort of the layers, right? Incontinence is, I'm really only mainly hurting myself by not using reason to protect myself from sin. Violence is mostly in the realm of physical harm, but it does extend to things like material harm. And then fraud is like a perversion of intellect. It's like God gave you the power of intellect, and you have specifically used it to cause problems. You've specifically used it to cause harm. It's sort of like a squandering of God's gift. I will say that, so I will cover this as I get to it. I will say that it can feel a little bit touchy that some of the things that are punished in hell are things that these days, contemporary thought we don't have as many issues with. Like, we will come up against, for instance, the sodomites, right? That's homosexuality. We have gluttony. For a person in medieval thought, Dante is shockingly progressive. I will let you come to your own conclusions. You don't have to take my word for it. But in my opinion, suicide as well. Dante is shockingly progressive. I mean, one of the clearest examples of that is how much medieval thought was not just contained, but was centered on blatant anti-Semitism. There is so much anti-Semitism in medieval thought. And Dante has pretty much no instances of Jewish people being punished for anything other than like very specific things that have nothing to do with being Jewish, right? Like, and I know that seems like that's such a low bar to cross. That's such a low bar to set, but like, for his time, Dante was shockingly progressive. Anyway, let us move on. Let us continue our walk. Regaining now my senses, which had fainted at the sight of those two who were kinsmen lovers, a piteous sight confusing me to tears, new suffering and new sinner suffering appeared to me, no matter where I moved or turned my eyes, no matter where I gazed. I am in the third circle, in the round of rain eternal, cursed, cold, and falling heavy, unchanging beat, unchanging quality. Thick hail and dirty water mixed with snow come down in torrents through murky air, and the earth is stinking from this soaking rain. Kerberos, a ruthless and fantastic beast, With all three throats howls out his dog-like sounds above the drowning sinners of this place. His eyes are red, his beard is slobbered black, his belly swollen, and he has claws for hands. He rips the spirits, flays and mangles them. Under the rain they howl like dogs, lying now on one side with the other as a screen, now on the other turning, these wretched sinners. When the slimy Kerberos caught sight of us, he opened up his mouth and showed his fangs. His body was one mass of twitching muscle. My master stooped, and spreading his wide fingers, he grabbed up a heaping fistful of the mud and flung it into those greedy gullets. As a howling cur, hungering to get fed, quiets down with the first mouthful of his food, busy with eating, wrestling with that alone, so it was with three filthy heads of the demon Kerberos, used to barking thunder on these dead souls who wished they were deaf. We walked across this marsh of shades, beaten down by the heavy rain, our feet pressing on their emptiness that looked like human form. Each sinner there was stretched out on the ground, except for one who quickly sat up straight, the moment that he saw us passing him by. "Oh, you there, being led through this inferno," he said. "Try to remember who I am, for you had life before I gave up mine." I said, "The pain you suffer here perhaps disfigures you beyond all recognition. I can't remember seeing you before. But tell me who you are, assigned to grieve in this sad place, afflicted by such torture that worse there well may be, but none more foul." "Your own city," he said, "so filled with envy its cup already overflows the brim, once held me the brighter life above. You citizens gave me the name of Chaco, and for my sin of gluttony I am damned, as you can see, to rain that beats me weak. And my sad sunken soul is not alone, for all these sinners here share in my pain and in my sin." And that was his last word. "Chaco," I said to him, "your grievous state weighs down on me. It makes me want to weep, but tell me, what will happen if you know, to the citizens of that divided state? And are there any honest men among them? And tell me, why is it so plagued with strife?" And he replied, "After much contention they will come to bloodshed. The rustic party will drive out the other by brutal means. Then it will come to pass this side will fall within 3 suns, and the other rise to power with the help of the one now listing toward both sides. For a long time they will keep their heads raised high, holding the others down with crushing weight, no matter how these weep or squirm for shame. 2 just men there are, but no one listens, for pride, envy, avarice are the 3 sparks that kindle in men's heart and set them burning." With his mournful words come to an end. With this, his mournful words came to an end. But I spoke back. "There's more I want to know. I beg you to provide me with more facts. Farinado and Tagiaiho, who were so worthy, Jacopo Rusticucci, Arrigo, Mosca, and the rest so bent on doing good. Where are they? Tell me what's become of them. The one great desire tortures me to know whether they taste heaven's sweetness or heaven's gall." "They lie below with blacker souls," he said, "by different sins pushed down to different depths. If you keep going, you may well see them all. But when you are once more in the sweet world, I beg you to remind our friends of me. I speak no more I answer you." He twisted his straight gaze into a squint, and stared a while at me, then bent his head, falling to join his other sightless peers. My guide then said to me, "He'll wake no more until the day the angel's trumpet blows, when the unfriendly judge shall come down here. Each soul shall find again this wretched tomb, assume his flesh and take human shape, and hear his fate resound eternally." And so we made our way through the filthy mess of muddy shades and slush, moving slowly, talking a little bit about the afterlife. I said, "Master, will these torments be increased or lessened on the final judgment day, or will the pain be just the same as now?" And he, "Remember your philosophy. The closer a thing comes to its perfection, the more keen will be its pleasure or its pain. Although this cursed race of punished souls shall never know the true joy of perfection, more perfect will their pain be then than now." We circled round that curving road while talking of more than I shall mention at this time. and came to the place where the ledge begins descending. There we found Plutus, mankind's archenemy. And that is the realm of the gluttonous. It's not Nimrod who speaks language we don't recognize. It's Plutus, and he's coming up in a moment. So there's a few interesting things to talk about here. The realm of the Gluttons is really much more aligned with medieval envy than it is gluttony. While Dante does use a word that represents gluttony, he doesn't specifically state that this is the realm of the Gluttons, and so envy is also possibly represented here. And what we consider to be envy and what the medievals meant when they said envy are really two very different things. Right now, when we say envy, what we really mean is we mean like I'm jealous. I desire to have what you have. But in medieval thought, envy more closely aligns with the idea of wishing worse for others, right? Like if someone else has more than me, rather than wishing that I had more, I'm actually wishing they had less. I'm wishing that they were brought down to my level instead. And that kind of matches more closely with what's being represented here in this circle, in the third circle. We meet a character who identifies himself as Chaco, but that's not his real name. I think his real name is known. Let me look at the notes really quickly. It's a nickname, Chaco del Anguilla. But Chaco specifically is a nickname that possibly means a slang term for like pig or hog. It's not obvious that that's true. There's like conflicting accounts, but some commentators have claimed that the name Chaco is slang for like pig. And so that's why that name's coming up. There's a lot of different forms of gluttony, though. This is not just talking about like what we sometimes think of when we say gluttony, when we mean like, you know, people who crave food and eat it, intemperately. But there's a lot of different types of gluttony, and I think it's really interesting to mention here because throughout Inferno, Dante is sometimes criticized or described as taking part in the punishment of the sinners. Sometimes he will take part in punishing sinners, right? He will see someone, he will be overcome with disgust, and he will cause some sort of harm or damage to them as part of that disgust. But additionally, a lot of Inferno is really interesting in the way that we sometimes see the poet or the pilgrim partake in the sin itself. So, in the realm of the Lustful, for instance, he was so overcome by passion that he swooned, right? You could see him partaking in that particular sin. He felt so impassioned that he passed out. And here, what's really interesting is if you kind of look at the conversation he has with Chaco, Chaco says at the end of almost every single one of his passages, he says, "I'm not going to say any more." And then Dante pries him for more information. "No, you have to tell me more. You have to tell me more." He has this voracious appetite for information, almost gluttonous to a point. And so in that way, you can kind of see the pilgrim as partaking in that sin. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at how the pilgrim interacts with hell as he traverses it. Some of my notes in my book are actually really funny to me. I wrote a note here. So the part where he says, "Master, will the torments be increased or lessened on the final judgment day, or will the pain be just the same as now?" And then he goes on. He says, Virgil says, "Remember your philosophy. The closer a thing comes to perfection, the more keen its pleasure or its pain will be." And I wrote to the side, "Law more," or "Law worse." I just thought it was funny. That's just a funny note to me. There's also a lot of food imagery in the Circle of the Gluttons. So first he encounters Kerberos, and Virgil shoves a fistful of muck down his throat, which has its own basis in like the Aeneid. If you go back to the Aeneid, when Aeneas comes across, I think it's still Kerberos. I don't remember if it's him or another beast in the Aeneid. I've never read the Aeneid, but when he encounters, I think Kerberos in the Aeneid, he shoves honeyed cakes down his throat. That's how Aeneas gets past Kerberos in the underworld. And so this is supposed to be like an allegory for that, where instead of shoving honeyed cakes down his throat to satisfy the beast's hunger, he's just shoving mud down his throat. Because Kerberos is not hungry for something to satisfy a craving. He is shoving just... I mean, Kerberos is just hungry. He is hungry, he wants to eat, because he is in the realm of the gluttonous. He just wants to eat something. And so Virgil, quick on his feet, thinks of the first thing he can. He just grabs a fistful of muck and shoves it full arm straight down his throat, which is fantastic. This is So there's like a real cutting off point in Inferno where we shift from Dante following in the tradition of Virgil's breakdown of hell as told in the Aeneid, to finally Dante kind of getting his own voice and his own legs under him and writing his own way. And we're still in that right now. We're in the early part of hell where we're following in Virgil's footsteps. So each circle is broken down very similarly. We encounter a great beast, we deal with that great beast, and then we encounter some sinners in that ring, and we meet the sinners and we move on. So, first we encountered Minos in the Lustful. Arguably, he's not really part of the Lustful thing, but we encounter him, and then we go and meet the Lustful. In the Gluttonous, we meet Kerberos. In the Avaricious and Prodigal, we meet Plutus, and then in the Wrathful and Sullen, we meet someone as well. So anyway, this is a pattern that is following, but will soon be broken. We will see that pattern break eventually. Let me see if there's any other notes in here I want to mention. Interestingly, he never says that Kerberos is a dog. Just for what it's worth, I want you to consider the fact that Dante is not imagining him as a dog. Let me read to you the description of him again, and you can decide for yourself whether or not it is dog-like or whether or not it is something else entirely. Kerberos, a ruthless and fantastic beast with all three throats, howls his dog-like sounds above the drowning sinners of this place. By the way, the other sinners were also described as howling like dogs, so that is not a giveaway. He says, his eyes are red, his beard is slobbered black, his belly swollen, and he has claws for hands. He rips the spirits and flays and mangles them. So. I just think it's interesting. Maybe consider that it is not a dog that Dante is imagining. It could be anything. Hey, Barrelin. I'm doing my best. Alright. Let's move forward. Oh, by the way, this is probably another instance where Dante gets sort of a textual problem, because he refers to Plutus here as mankind's archenemy at the end of Canto VI. And he's probably conflating Plutus with Pluto, like, as in Hades. That's not to say that it's not possible that he's just taking some liberty, but it does seem like he's combining the two. It does seem like he's conflating the two together. Alright. Canto 7. Pape Satan, Alepe! The voice of Plutus clucked these words out at us. And that kind sage, to whom all things were known, said reassuringly, "Do not let fear defeat you, for whatever his power, he cannot stop our journey down this rock." Then he turned toward that swollen face of rage, crying, "Be quiet, cursed wolf of hell! Feed on the burning bile that rots your guts. This journey to the depths does have a reason, for it is willed on high, where Michael wrought a just revenge for the bold assault on God. As sails swollen by wind, when the ship's mast breaks, collapsed, deflated, tangled in a heap, just so the savage beast fell to the ground." And then we started down a fourth abyss, making our way along the dismal slope where all the evil of the world is dumped. Ah, God's avenging justice. Who could heap up suffering and pain as strange as I saw here? How can we let our guilt bring us to this? As every wave Charybdis whirls to sea, comes crashing against its countercurrent wave, so these folks here must dance their roundelay. More shades were here than anywhere above, and from both sides, to the sound of their own screams straining their chests, they rolled enormous weights. And when they met and clashed against each other, they turned to push the other way, one side screaming, "Why hoard?" The other side, "Why waste?" And so they moved back round the gloomy circle, returning on both sides to opposite poles to scream their shameful tune another time. Again they came to clash and turn and roll forever in their semicircle joust, and I, my heart pierced through by such a sight, spoke out, "My master, please explain to me, who are these people here? Were they all priests, these tonsured souls I see there to our left?" He said, In their first life, all you see here had such myopic minds they could not judge with moderation when it came to spending. Their barking voices made this clear enough when they arrive at the 2 points on the circle where opposing guilts drive them into two. The ones who have the bald spot on their heads were priests and popes and cardinals, in whom avarice is most likely to prevail. And I, master, in such a group as this, I should be able to recognize a few who dirtied themselves by such crimes as these. And he replied, "Yours is an empty hope. Their undistinguished life made them foul, and now makes them harder to distinguish. Eternally the two will come to blows. Then from the tomb they will be resurrected, these with tight fists, those without any hair. It was squandering and hoarding that have robbed them of the lovely world, and got them in this brawl. I will not waste choice words describing it. You see, my son, the short-lived mockery of all the wealth that is fortune's keep, over which the human race is bickering. For all the gold that is, or ever was, beneath the moon won't buy a moment's rest for even one of these weary souls. Master, now tell me, what this fortune is you touched upon before? What is she like who holds all worldly wealth within her fists?" And he to me, "O foolish race of man, how overwhelming is your ignorance! Now listen while I tell you what she means. That one, whose wisdom knows infinity, made all the heavens and gave each one a guide, and each sphere shining shines on all the others. So light is spread with equal distribution. For worldly splendors he decreed the same, and ordained a guide and general ministress, who would at her discretion shift the world's vain wealth from nation to nation, house to house, with no chance of interference from mankind. So, while one nation rules, another falls, according to whatever she decrees, her sentence hidden like a snake in the grass. Your knowledge has no influence on her, for she foresees, she judges, and she rules her kingdom as the other gods do theirs. Her changes never take rest. Necessity keeps her in constant motion, as men come and go to take their turn with her. And this is she so crucified and cursed. Even those in luck who should be praising her instead revile her and condemn her acts. But she is blessed, and in her bliss hears nothing. With all God's joyful first created creatures, she turns her sphere, blessed, turns it with joy. Now let's move down to greater wretchedness. The stars that rose when I set out for you are going down. We cannot stay too long. We cross the circle to its other bank, passing a spring that boils and overflows into a ditch the spring itself cut out. The water was deeper dark than Perse, and we, with its grey waves for company, made our way along a rough, strange path. This dingy little stream, when it's reached the bottom of the grey malignant slopes, becomes a swamp that has the name of Styx. And I, intent on looking as we pass, saw muddy people moving in that marsh, all naked with their faces scarred by rage. They fought each other, not with hands alone, but struck with head and chest and feet and limb. With teeth they tore each other limb from limb. And the good teacher said, "My son, now see the souls of those that anger overcame. And I ask you to believe me when I say, beneath the slimy top are sighing souls who make these waters bubble at the surface. Your eyes will tell you this. Just look around. Bogged in this slime, they say. Sluggish we were in sweet air made happy by the sun, and smoke of depression was smoldering in our hearts. Now we lie sluggish here in this black muck. This is the hymn they gurgle in their throats, but cannot sing in words that truly sound. Then, making a wide arc, we walked along the pond, between the dry bank and the slime, our eyes still fixed on those who gobbled mud. We came, in time, to the foot of a high tower. So, this canto actually covers two separate circles. So they say anger but mean clinically depressed. It's actually hard to say. A lot of commentary claims that underneath the muck, the people that are there are actually the slothful, not the angry. But Dante never, the poet never writes that they are the slothful. Never actually uses the word sloth, even though some translations do use the word sloth. The actual word that Dante uses is smoke of depression, though a lot of times that's translated as smoke of sloth. It's hard to say. It's hard to say, I guess is my answer. So this covers two separate circles, circles 4 and 5. The first circle that we encounter is the circle of the Prodigal and the Miserly. Prodigal refers to people who spend wastefully. They have great resources and they spend it just wantonly. This is actually separate from something else we'll see later in Inferno, people who spend aggressively. Those are referred to as the wasters, usually. But this is people who spend in such a way that they do not use their resources to honor God. I'm pretty sure prodigal and profligate means the same thing. Yeah, prodigal comes from, the word, prodigious, like having a lot of. Not like prodigy, like having talent. Though I'm sure those are based on similar roots as well. We start off meeting Plutus, who says some words that translators have spent years trying to translate, but more or less everyone's agreed that it's meant to be untranslatable. He says Papi Satan Alepe, which, there's definitely information in there that you can get, right? Papi Satan is probably Father Satan, and the Alepe is possibly a reference to, like, Alpha, like the way that you would honor God by calling him the Alpha. So, in this way, you could probably view Plutus to be, like, honoring Satan, essentially. But it's mostly meant to be, more or less unintelligible nonsense, and that's the point, is that it's meant to be unintelligible nonsense. The whole really, really long diatribe that Virgil makes about fortune is actually really interesting, because what he's actually talking about when he's talking about fortune is he's talking about God, but he's using his terminology. He would have had no idea what God was. Like, he doesn't, that, from like, pagan thought of his era, he wouldn't really know what God is, but he's conflated God with the goddess Fortune, and is describing how great the goddess Fortune is, basically just describing God. And that's the whole idea there, you know, the one whose wisdom knows infinity made all the heavens and gave each one a guide. Light is spread with equal distribution. He talks about the construction of paradise. Your knowledge has no influence on her. She foresees, she judges, she rules her kingdom as other gods do. He's talking about God, but he's talking about it in his terminology that he understands, essentially. That's the idea. There's some other kind of interesting things going on here. It would have been very dangerous in this era for Dante to write about popes and cardinals and priests being in hell and being punished for these sorts of sins. Like, this is actually a fairly risky thing for him to write about. This is a sort of thing that could have him excommunicated and killed. So it's interesting that he's taking these shots. I mean, you know, he's calling it the way he sees it. He's saying that the tonsured ones, tonsured referring to the haircut that priests often have, where they have the bald spot on top with the ring of hair around it. That is that haircut is referred to as tonsured. He's essentially saying, you know, those were the ones who were wasting. They had all of these resources and they were not spending it to do anything good. And then the other side were the greedy, the miserly, the people who had the resources but refused to spend it to better themselves or the communities around them. So both of these are sins of people who have resources and use it incorrectly, right? God, I mean, in medieval thought, in Christian orthodoxy, it is because of God that you receive these resources, right? In your life, the reason why you have wealth is because God has given it to you. You have been given that wealth as a gift from God. And the people who either just save it and don't do good with it, or the people who spend it recklessly and uselessly, are people who are using God's gift incorrectly. So the two ends of the spectrum are wrong, is essentially what's happening here. And their punishment is that they are rolling giant rocks, and clashing into one another. It's kind of like a jousting almost that's happening, where they roll them against one another and they're screaming at one another, you know, why waste, why spend? Basically one side is yelling, why would you bother doing the thing you did, but they're missing the point that they did wrong as well, right? So like one side, you know, the wasters or the prodigal are yelling, why save? Why bother saving your resources, not realizing that they had also done wrong themselves? So they're kind of punishing each other, essentially. Let's see. This is also one of the first instances of, Virgil having knowledge that maybe he shouldn't have. He knows the positions of the stars, even though they're deep underground. And he's constantly updating us with, like, what time it is. You can actually use some of these references to figure out the exact time. So, for instance, he says, the stars that rose when I set out for you are going down. We cannot stay too long. You can use some of these references to figure out exactly what time of day it is at any given point. And it does sort of track progress as we go. Let's see, I already mentioned that the bodies underneath the muck are perhaps not slothful. Perhaps they are just more angry. It's hard to say. What we do know is that there are a few of the classical 7 deadly sins that don't appear in hell, at least not specifically, right? You have anger appears, greed appears, lust appears, wrath appears, but sloth is never specifically mentioned. Envy is never specifically mentioned. Those are much more complex sins. And you could make the argument broadly that, well, those get covered en masse down below, right? Like sloth is a big element of, like, heresy and some of the elements of fraud as well. And envy comes in later with fraud and treachery. But I think what's more helpful is to realize, again, that this is a poem that's constantly evolving, it's being written as he goes. He's in exile. The manuscript process is complicated in this era. It's not like you have a text editor where you can just erase parts you don't like. Parchment's expensive, writing utensils are expensive. You can't just, like, cross it out and start again easily. So a lot of times there are going to be things that he will correct later. There will be changes he makes as he's going. And one of those is that we're just about to hit a huge tonal shift. Like, this is the point where the poem changes. This is the point where the poem becomes a different poem. Right here. Like, you're about to see it as we shift into the next canto. It's totally unlike anything that we've read so far. And even going further on, hey Liz, welcome. Even going further on, what we're going to notice is that he will sometimes, like, make reference to earlier chapters and will describe them totally differently. And in a sense, it is kind of a retcon, right? He'll say, hey, you remember, there's a section later where he'll be like, hey, you remember when I encountered that leopard and I pulled off my belt and I used it to try to catch the leopard? And it's like, no man, you didn't do that. But he's, like, rewriting it on the fly. He wanted to have that be as part of chapter 1. He wanted that to be part of Canto 1. And so in a later canto, he's saying, hey, you remember when I did this thing? That definitely isn't anywhere in Canto 1. But he's, like, trying to modify it as he goes. So it's kind of... yeah. Alright, Canto 8. I must explain, however, that before we finally reached the foot of that high tower, our eyes had been attracted to its summit by 2 small flames we saw flare up just there. And, so far off the eye could hardly see, another burning torch flashed back a sign. I turned to that vast sea of human knowledge. What signal is this? And the other flame, what does it answer? And who's doing this? And he replied, you should already see across the filthy waves what has been summoned, unless the marsh's vapors hide it from you. A bowstring never shot an arrow off that could cut the thin air any faster than a little boat that I saw that very second, skimming across the water in our direction with a solitary steersman who was shouting, aha, I've got you now, you wretched soul. Pelagius, this time you shout in vain, my lord responded. You will have us with you no longer than it takes to cross the muck. As one who learns of some incredible trick just played on him flares up resentfully, so Pelagius, there, was seething in his anger. My leader calmly stepped into the skiff, and when he was inside he had me enter, and only then it seemed to carry weight. Soon as my guide and I were in the boat, the ancient prow began to plow the water more deeply now than any time before. And as we sailed the course of this dead channel, there before me rose a slimy shape that said, Who are you? Who come before your time? And I spoke back, Though I come, I do not stay. But who are you in all your ugliness? You see that I am one who weeps, he answered. And then I said to him, May you weep and wail stuck here in this place forever, you damned soul. For filthy as you are, I recognize you. With that, he stretched both hands out toward the boat, but, on his guard, my teacher pushed him back. Away, get down there with the other curs. And then he put his arms around my neck and kissed my face and said, Indignant soul, blessed is she in whose womb you were conceived. In the world this man was filled with arrogance, and nothing good about him decks my memory. For this his shade is filled with fury here. Many in life esteem themselves great men, who then will wallow here like pigs in mud, leaving behind their repulsive fame. Master, it certainly would make me happy to see him dunked in this slop once more before we leave this lake. It truly would. And he to me, before the other shore comes to sight, you will be satisfied. A wish like that is worthy of fulfillment. Soon afterward, I saw the wretch so mangled by a gang of muddy souls that to this day I thank my lord and praise him for that sight. Get Filippo Argenti, they all cried, and at those shouts the Florentine gone mad turned on himself and bit his body fiercely. We left him there, I'll say no more about him. A wailing noise began to pound my ears and made me strain my eyes to see ahead. And now, my son, the gentle teacher said, coming closer is the city we call Dis, with its great walls and its fierce citizens. And I, master, already I can see the clear glow of its mosques above the valley, burning bright red as though just forged and left to smolder. And he, to me, eternal fire burns within, giving off the reddish glow you see diffused through this lower hell. And then at last we entered those deep moats that circle all of this unhappy city, whose walls, it seemed to me, were made of iron. For quite a while we sailed around until we reached a place and heard our boatsman shout with all his might, "Get out! Here is the entrance!" I saw more than 1,000 fiendish angels perching above the gates in rage, screaming, "Who is the one approaching? Who, without death, dares walk into the kingdom of the dead?" And my wise teacher made some kind of signal announcing he would speak to them in secret. They managed to suppress their great resentment enough to say, "You come, but he must go, who thought to walk so boldly through this realm. Let him retrace his foolish way alone. Just let him try. And you who led him here through this dark land, you'll stay right where you are." And now, my reader, consider how I felt when those foreboding words came to my ears. I thought I'd never see our world again. Oh, my dear guide, who more than 7 times restored my confidence and rescued me from the many dangers that blocked my going on. Don't leave me, please, I cried in my distress. And if the journey onward is denied us, let us turn our footsteps back together quickly. Then that lord who brought me all this way said, "Do not fear, the journey we are making none can prevent. Such power did decree it. Wait here for me and feed your weary spirit with comfort and good hope. You can be sure I will not leave you in this underworld." With this, he walks away. He leaves me here, that gentle father, and I stay, doubting and battling with my thoughts of yes, but no. I could not hear what he proposed to them, but they did not remain with him for long. I saw them race each other back for home. Our adversary slammed the heavy gates in my lord's face, and he stood there outside, then turned toward me and walked back very slowly with eyes downcast, all self-assurance now erased from his forehead, sighing, "Who are these to forbid my entrance into the halls of grief?" He spoke to me. "You need not be disturbed by my vexation, for I shall win the contest, no matter how they plot to keep us out. This insolence of theirs is nothing new. They used it once at a less secret gate, which is, and forever will be, unlocked. You saw the deadly words inscribed above it, and now, already past it and descending across the circles down the slope alone, comes the one by whom the city will be opened." So this is Dante and Virgil encountering the walls of Dis. They're leaving the Circle of the Wrathful. That's what happened when he encountered Filippo Argenti. A man who, there's stories about, I won't go too deep into who that is, but he knew him to be a angry man. This is the first time where Dante sort of revels in the suffering of the damned. This is the first damned who he isn't moved by, and perhaps it's because he knew this man. Perhaps it's because he's sort of learning what he's supposed to learn. I mean, the message that Virgil is trying to teach him is that it is divine justice who has put all sinners here, and their damnation is actually something to take pleasure in, not to be unhappy about. Wrath is considered to be incontinence. So wrath is viewed in medieval thought as being undirected anger. Someone who is angry and frustrated but does not direct that harm at someone. It is not what you might think as wrath, where it's like you are violent. We will address violence later. But wrath is sort of undirected anger. Yeah, there are a few people who were still alive at the time this was written, and I guess Filippo Argenti was one of them. I didn't remember that offhand, but that's actually a really good note. Um, this canto picks up directly from the previous one, by the way. So the previous canto ends. I'll sort of read them in one motion so you can hear it. So the previous canto ends with, "We came in time to the foot of a high tower. I must explain, however, that before we reached the foot of that high tower, our eyes had been attracted to its summit." So this is kind of showing that there's not meant to be a huge break between some of these. It's meant to flow somewhat smoothly at times. You can also notice that Dante finally got over his reticence to deal with the issue of the pilgrim's corporeality. When he gets in the boat, it weighs down, it moves more slowly. It's a strain for Pelagius to move the boat, and a great frustration for him to have to do so. So Dante is finally handling the issue of the pilgrim being corporeal and the way that that affects the world around him. We're only going to see more instances of that as we go on. This is certainly not the end of it. Let's see. Virgil is so pleased by the pilgrim's righteous indignation when the pilgrim shows anger or indignation toward Filippo Argenti. Virgil wraps his arms around his neck and kisses his face, saying, "Indignant soul, blessed is she in whose womb you were conceived." And basically tells him that, this is exactly what you're supposed to do. This is great. A lot of translations mention on the walls of Dis him being able to see the clear glow of its mosques, and it's easy to write this off as an instance of xenophobia. In a case, to a certain extent, it may be, right. Placing Muslims in hell. Not necessarily a great look to our sensibilities, but it's also possible that this is just a poor translation. A lot of translators translate it not as mosques but as minarets, which do have a similar shape, and I think what Dante was really trying to get at mostly was shape, not necessarily that they were Muslim places of worship. I don't know. But for what it's worth, I mean, if it helps you kind of analyze this, you should know that there are a lot of Muslims that appear in Limbo, there's a lot of Muslims that appear in Purgatory, and there's Muslims that even appear in Paradise. So, it's not just cut and dry that he's saying that Muslims go to hell, which is perhaps welcome to see. He says that, "My dear guide who more than 7 times restored my confidence." There's actually sort of a historical precedent for using the number 7 to just represent the concept of many, like quote-unquote many. Who was driving the boat? It was Pelagius. Filippo Argenti was in the Styx, and he was trying to climb out of the boat to attack Dante, or at least make his presence known. There were a lot of instances in... There's at least a precedent for the number 7 being used to reference the concept of many. But it actually turns out to be the case that you can go back and find 7 references of Virgil instilling confidence in the pilgrims. So you could read it either way if you really want to. It doesn't. I don't think it requires too much discussion. Also, especially if you read it in the original Florentine, medieval Florentine. But even the translations usually do a good job about this, about the way that present tense versus past tense is used. Usually when the poet writes about the journey of the pilgrim, he writes in past tense because it's an event that happened in the past. It's from the perspective of the poet having returned home to write about this. Occasionally, though, he will slip into present tense and usually it's used to instill a sense of to give a sense of significance to events that really affected him emotionally. So, for instance, when he says, please do not leave me, and Virgil says, just stay here, I'm going to go talk to them at the gate, he leaves them anyway. Actually, he says, I will not leave you in this underworld, and then immediately walks away. Dante immediately says, he leaves me here, and I stay. So it's not past tense, it's present tense. Like, he's emotionally affected by this, which is kind of an interesting little minor thing. And the last thing that I'll mention is that Virgil says that this insolence of theirs is nothing new. They used it once at a less secret gate. This is actually a reference to the harrowing of hell, when Jesus came down to hell in order to release the Old Testament figures from the limbo of the fathers. What this is implying is that when Jesus came down to hell, the demons tried to prevent him from going through the main gate, the first gate, you know, the I am the way to a city of woe, I am the way to an eternal darkness. They tried to stop him at that gate, and basically Jesus opened that gate and made sure it would never be shut again. It could not be shut. And so that's kind of just a really light reference back to the harrowing of hell. All right, well that's all the notes I have about Canto VIII. Let's move on to Canto IX. The color of the coward on my face when I realized my guide was turning back made him quickly change the color of his own. He stood alert, like one who strains to hear. His eyes could not see far enough ahead to cut the heavy fog of that black air. But surely we were meant to win this fight, he said, or else... But no, such help was promised. How much time it's taking him to come. I saw too well how quickly he amended his opening words with what he added on. They were different from the ones he first pronounced. But nonetheless, his words made me afraid. Perhaps because the phrase he left unfinished, I finished with worse meaning than he meant. Sorry, we're here at the walls of Dis. Has anyone before ever descended to this sad hollow's depths from that first circle whose pain is all in having hope cut off? I put this question to him. He replied, it's not useful for one of us to make the journey I am making now, but it happens I was once down here before, conjured by that heartless witch Erichtho, who could recall the spirit to its body. Soon after I had left my flesh in death, she sent me through these walls, and down as far as the pit of Judas to bring a spirit out. And that place is the lowest and darkest and furthest from the sphere that circles all. I know the road, and well you can be sure. This swamp that breathes with a prodigious stink lies in a circle around the doleful city that now we cannot enter without strife. And he said other things, but I forgot them, for suddenly my eyes were drawn above up to the fiery top of that high tower, where in no time at all, and all at once, sprang up three hellish furies stained with blood, their bodies and their gestures those of females. Their waists were bound in cords of wild green hydras, horned snakes and little serpents grew as hair, and twinned themselves around the savage temples. And he who had occasion to know well the handmaids of the Queen of Timeless Woe cried out to me, look there, the fierce Ernys. That is Megara, the one to the left. And that one raving on the right, Alecto. Tisiphone in the middle. He said no more. With flailing palms the three would beat their breasts, then tear them with their nails, shrieking so loud. I drew close to the poet, confused with fear. Medusa, come! We'll turn him to stone! They shouted all together, glaring down. How wrong we were to let off Theseus lightly. Now turn back and cover up your eyes, for if the Gorgon comes, you should see her. There would be no returning to the world. These were my master's words. He turned me round and did not trust my hands to hide my eyes, but placed his own on mine and kept them covered. Oh, all of you whose intellects are sound, look now and see the meaning that is hidden beneath the veil that covers my strange verses. And then, above the filthy swell approaching, a blast of sound, shot through with fear, exploded, making both shores of hell begin to tremble. It sounded like one of those violent winds born from the clash of counter-temperatures that tear through forests raging on unchecked. It splits and rips and carries off the branches, and proudly whips the dust up in its path, and makes the beasts and shepherds flee its course. He freed my eyes and said, "Now turn around and set your sight along the ancient scum, there where the marsh mish is hovering thickest." As frogs before their enemy, the snake, all scatter through the pond and then dive down until each one is squatting on the bottom, so I saw more than 1,000 fear-shocked souls in flight, clearing the path of the one who came walking the Styx, his feet dry on the water. From time to time, with his left hand, he fanned his face to push the putrid air away, and this was all that seemed to weary him. I was certain now that he was sent from heaven. I turned to my guide, but he made a sign to keep my silence and bow low to this one. Ah, the scorn that filled his holy presence. He reached the gate and touched it with a wand. It opened without resistance from inside. "Oh, heaven's outcast, despicable souls!" he started, standing on the dreadful threshold. "What insolence is it that breeds in you? Why do you stubbornly resist that whose end can never be denied, and which, more than one time, increased your suffering? What do you gain by locking horns with fate? If you remember well, your Cerberus still bears his chin and throat peeled clean for that." He turned then and retracted the squalid path without one word to us, and on his face the look of one concerned and spurred by things that were not those he found surrounding him. And then we started moving toward the city and the safety of the holy words pronounced. We entered there, and with no opposition, and I, so anxious to investigate the state of souls locked up in such a fortress, once in the place allowed my eyes to wander, and saw in all directions spreading out a countryside of pain and ugly anguish. As at Arles, when the Rhone turns to stagnant waters, or at Pola, near Quanero's Gulf, that closes Italy and bathes her confines, the sepulchres make all the land uneven. So they did here, strewn in all directions, except the graves here served a crueler purpose. For scattered everywhere among the tombs were flames that kept them glowing far more hot than any iron an artisan might use. Each tomb had its lid loose, pushed to one side, and from within came forth such a fierce laments that I was sure inside were tortured souls. I asked, "Master, what kind of shades are these lying down here, buried in the graves of stone, speaking their presence in such dolorous sighs?" And he replied, "There lie the arch-heretics of every sect, with all of their disciples, more than you think packed within these tombs. Like heretics lie buried with their like heretics lie buried with their like, and the graves burn more or less accordingly. Then, turning to the right, we moved ahead, between the torments and those high walls." And that's Canto IX. So cool stuff in here. We start off with Virgil being worried. He was promised that the path was ordained for him to guide Dante through the underworld and toward purgatory, and yet he came up against a great stumbling block. And he says, "But surely we were meant to win this fight, or else..." But no, such help was promised. So Virgil has his doubts. He doubts whether or not help is coming, and it eventually does. But he has a moment of doubt. They were both there. The Furies and Medusa are two different characters. The Furies are like children or followers of Medusa. I don't remember offhand. There's also like a really interesting backstory here for Virgil, one that obviously is entirely made up, but a fascinating one, where he says that right after he died, soon after I had left my flesh in death, he was actually a magician named Erictho, which is from the story of the Pharsalia by Lucan. So in the Pharsalia, Erictho has the ability to revive people, like bring them back from the dead. And so what's happening here is Dante is kind of becoming more confident in being able to write stories that like complement other people's stories, right? Like it's kind of a big deal to get the confidence to be able to write a story that is almost like fanfic for your other favorite stories. Because I don't think the Pharsalia really goes into what this process looks like. It doesn't go into the process of how the magician Erichtho is capable of bringing back people from the dead. But what Dante is writing here is that process was actually made actually happened by virtue of Virgil being sent all the way down to the circle of Judeca, to the circle of Judas, retrieving a soul and bringing it all the way back. And the reason why this backstory is added, one, it's interesting, it's cool, it gives some more depth to Virgil, but also because it gives us, the reader, confidence that Virgil knows the path, right? He's not a blind guide. He's been this way before. He had to travel all the way down to Judeca. And so he knows the road. He knows what's ahead. He knows how to guide us there. And it's supposed to give us more confidence in Virgil's ability to be the guide to for Dante. Yeah, we meet Megara, Alecto, and Tisiphone, the Furies. He refers to them as the Erinyes. I believe that they are meant to be... I want to say that they're meant to be like children of Medusa, at least in this retelling. I don't... Let me look to see if that's in the notes. One of the three Gorgons. I'm trying to figure out, at least in Dante's eyes, how they relate to Medusa. I think they're just... maybe they're just working together. Because I know that in classical mythology they're not children of Medusa, but I'm not sure how they relate in Dante's eyes. That's not a detail I recall offhand. Let's see. Dante shows off how much he knows about meteorology by talking about how tornadoes are formed, whirlwinds are formed, born from the clash of counter temperatures that tear through forests raging on unchecked. To the best of medieval science, that's at least accurate to its time, for how that works. There's some references to Ovid in here. I don't think you care about those. The question of who was actually sent down to open the gates of Dis is kind of an interesting one. He doesn't actually say specifically who opened the gates of Dis. It's probably Michael, the angel Michael, that was sent down to help. But his depiction is actually incredibly similar to the god Mercury. And so it could be a reference to Mercury. It could be a conflation of the two characters. It could be just Mercury. It could be just Michael. But there's a lot of sort of like classical references happening there. We get an early look into what it means to like how the heretics are punished. So heresy is punished by being crammed into a sepulcher, a grave, with people who believe the same thing as you. So each grave is essentially sort of like a partitioning of each type of heresy, and we'll see a few of those in the next canto. Like what types of heresy are being punished here. It is also worth noting right before we jump into the heretics that it actually you can actually see it on this map here, the one that's on stream. Heresy exists outside of the Aristotelian sins. Like if you try to figure out which sin does heresy fall into, is it incontinence? Is it violence? Is it fraud? By the way, in Aristotelian thought, it wouldn't be called violence and fraud. It would be called violence, or sorry, it would be called violence and malice. But anyway, the question is, where would heresy fall? It's a crime of wrong thought, of having information available to you about what is true and thinking incorrectly, which is not really incontinence, it's not really violence, it's not really anything. So this is a sin that appears on the boundary between incontinence and violence, and it's not really part of either. I don't know how much Inferno affected future orthodoxy. My guess would be not a ton, but I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing, is that according to Aristotelian thought, this would not be a sin, right? Thinking the wrong thing is not... It's not causing harm, it's not a crime of passion, it's not anything. It's, fine. It's not due to a weakness of the flesh or mind. It's not a form of violence or fraud. It's sin based on intellectual pride. And it's only considered to be a sin because it denies the Christian concept of reality. Well, inasmuch as it causes harm to oneself because you don't follow doctrine, but in general, at least according to Aristotelian thinking, it wouldn't be really a crime. It wouldn't be a sin, I guess. I'm glad you're enjoying. Yeah, the ones that actually put heresy to purpose and cause harm do appear in the schismatics later. Which is like one of the next to last of the Malbolge. Alright. So we're in the heretics now. Now onward down a narrow path. Between the city's ramparts and the suffering, my master walks, I following close behind. O lofty power, who through these impious gyres lead me around as you see fit, I said. I want to know, I want to understand. The people buried in these sepulchres, can they be seen? I mean, since all the lids are off the tombs and no one stands on guard. And they will forever be locked up when they return here from Jehoshaphat with the bodies that they left up on the world. The private cemetery on this side serves Epicurus and his followers, who make the soul die when the body dies. As for the question you just put to me, it will be answered soon. Well, we are here, and and the wish you are keeping from me will be granted. And I, oh my good guide, I do not hide my heart. I'm trying not to talk too much, as you have told me more than once to do. O Tuscan, walking through our flaming city alive, and speaking with such elegance, be kind enough to stop here for a while. Your mode of speech identifies you clearly as one whose birthplace is that noble city with which in my time, perhaps, I was too harsh. One of the vaults resounded suddenly with these clear words, and I, intimidated, drew up a little closer to my guide, who said, What are you doing? Turn around and look at Farinata, who has risen. You will see him from the waist up, standing straight. I already had my eyes fixed on his face, and there he stood out tall, with his chest and brow proclaiming his disdain for all this hell. My guide, with a gentle push, encouraged me to move among the sepulchres toward him. Be sure you choose your words with care, he said. When I reached the margin of his tomb, he looked at me and half contemptuously asked, And who would your ancestors be? And I, who wanted only to oblige him, held nothing back, but told him everything. At this he lifted up his brows a little, then said, Bitter enemies of mine they were, and of my ancestors, and of my party. I had to scatter them, not once, but twice. They were expelled, but only to return from everywhere, I said. Not once, but twice. An art your men, however, never mastered. Just then, along that same tomb's open ledge, a shade appeared, but just down to his chin, beside this other. I think he got up kneeling. He looked around, and as though he hoped to see if someone else perhaps had come with me, and when his expectation was deceived, he started weeping. If it be great genius that carries you along through this blind jail, where is my son? Why is he not with you? I do not come alone, I said to him. That one waiting over there guides me through here. The one perhaps your Guido held in scorn. The place of pain assigned to him, and what he asked, already had revealed his name to me and made my pointed answer possible. Instantly he sprang to his full height and cried, "What did you say? He held? Is he not living?" The day's sweet light no longer strikes his eyes. And when he heard the silence of my delay responding to his question, he collapsed into his tomb, not to be seen again. That other stately shade, at whose request I had first stopped to talk, showed no concern, nor moved his head, nor turned to see what happened. He merely picked up where he left off. "If that art they did not master," he went on, "that gives me greater pain than does this bed. But the face of the queen who reigns down here will glow not more than 50 times before you learn how hard it is to master such an art. And as I hope that you may once more know the sweet world, tell me, why should your party be so harsh to my clan in every law they make?" I answered, "The massacre and butchery that stained the waters of Arabia red now cause such laws to issue from our councils." Arabia red. He sighed, shaking his head. "It was not I alone took part," he said. "Nor certainly would I have joined the rest without good cause. But I alone stood up when all of them were ready to have Florence razed. It was I who openly stood up in her defense." "And now, as I would have your seed find peace," I said, "I beg you to resolve a problem that has kept my reason tangled in a knot. If I've heard correctly, all of you can see ahead to what the future holds, but your knowledge of the present is not clear." "Down here we only see those with faulty vision Down here we see like those with faulty vision who only see," he said, "what's at a distance. This much the Sovereign Lord grants us here. When events are close to us, or when they happen, our mind is blank, and were it not for others, we would know nothing of your living state. Thus you can understand how all our knowledge will be completely dead at that time when the door to the future things is closed forever." Then I, moved by regret for what I'd done, said, "Now will you please tell the fallen one his son is still on the earth among the living? And if, when he asked, silence was my answer, tell him, while he was speaking, my thoughts were struggling with that point you just solved for me." My teacher had begun to call me back, so I quickly asked that spirit to reveal the names of those who shared the tomb with him. He said, "More than 1,000 lie with me. The second Frederick is here, and the Cardinal is with us, and the rest I shall not mention." His figure disappeared. I made my way to the ancient poet, reflecting on those words which were prophetic enemies. He moved, and as we went along he said, "What troubles you so? Why are you so distraught?" And I told him all the thoughts that filled my mind. "Be sure your mind retains," the sage commanded, "those words you heard pronounced against yourself, and listen carefully now." He raised a finger. "When at last you stand in the glow of her sweet ray, the one whose splendid eyes see everything, from her you will learn your life's itinerary." Then to the left he turned, leaving the walls, he headed toward the center by a path that strikes into a vale, whose stench arose, disgusting as up high we were. And that's Canto X, perhaps one of the most famous cantos in all of Inferno. This is him encountering Farinata, Farinata was one of his political rivals, if I'm not mistaken, which I want to make sure I'm not before I say it. Farinata was a Ghibelline, which I mentioned at the beginning. The politics of Florence had started at one point as being a war between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines believing that the Empire should have control over Florence, and the Guelphs believing that the papacy should have dominion over Florence. And so when he says things like, bitter enemies of mine they were, and ancestors and my party, I had to scatter them once, not once, but twice. And Dante returns with, they were expelled, but only to return, not once, but twice, an art your men never mastered. He's essentially saying, yeah, you ran us out of town once, and we came back, and then we ran you out of town once, and you came back, but we won in the end. the last time we ran you out and you never came back. Which is, Farinata is not the kind of man to just take that on the chin. He doesn't love that so much. The other person that we meet, though it's not named directly in here, is Cavalcante de Cavalcanti, which was the father of Guido del Cavalcanti, who was another poet and a good friend of Dante's in real life. They were good friends, though they were in. So they were both white Guelphs. Essentially, what Cavalcante is saying is he's saying, like, if this is a journey of genius, like if this is supposed to be a genius leading another genius through hell to witness it and write about it, where's my son? My son was a great poet, and he should definitely be here to see this. And Dante refers to responds and he says, well, perhaps it's because the one who's leading me here is the one who your Guido held in scorn. He could be referring to a number of people there. He could be referring to Virgil as, like, maybe Guido didn't honor the classic poets very well. Or maybe he's referring to Beatrice. There's reason to think he could be referring to Beatrice as being someone he held in scorn. But whatever the case may be, the part that Cavalcante really singles out is that he said held in scorn, like past tense. Which is fine, but what he hears is that my son's dead, right? He didn't know that his son was dead. And so he's like, oh my god, my son's dead. And he just basically is like, oh, I'm out. That sucks. I'm having a bad time now. Only for Dante to later say, like, hey, your son's not actually dead. He tries to get Farinata to pass that message along, but who knows? Farinata doesn't seem concerned with anyone but himself, really. In fact, he seems so unconcerned with anyone else that when he's asked who he's in there with, he says, more than 1,000 lie with me. The second Frederick and the Cardinals with us. He names a few famous people, and he says, the rest I shall not mention. Which is very clearly him being like, those people are below my station. I do not care about them. He only mentions the ones who are going to make him seem better by contrast. There's a lot that goes on in this passage. This is one. This canto alone, people have written like doctoral dissertations on. Like this. There's a ton of depth to this canto in particular. It is a famous one for dissecting. My notes are absurd in this. Just like trying to write down everything that's in here. And I won't bore you with every last detail. Some of the things that we do learn through here, however. First, Farinata makes a prophecy. He specifically says that the face of the queen who reigns down here will glow not more than 50 times before you learn how hard it is to master such an art. And this is prophetic and quite circuitous way of saying that within 50 months... because the queen of the one who reigns down here is the moon. Before 50 months pass, you will learn how hard it is to master such an art. Master the art of returning from where you came. And in fact, the accuracy is absurd with that timeline because this takes place in what, like approximately April of 1300. The year 1300 is when this journey's happening. And I think it's by June or July of 1302. No, 1304. He gets exiled from Florence. So, like, I'm probably getting the dates wrong, but like the timing is perfect. The timing is accurate. It's so accurate. It is like 50 months that pass. Also, we learn about what life is like for the damned. So they actually can see the past and the future. That's the reason why we're getting all of these prophecies from people. They're not just like speculating. These people can see the future, but they can't see what's happening now. Don't dive too deep into that because it's really hard to not like come up with plot holes in how that mechanically actually works, but in short, the idea is that the only way that people in hell know what's going on at that moment in time is people who die kind of bring news down, right? So like if you died today and you went down to hell, you'd tell everyone what's going on in the world that day, and that's how they know what's going on in the current day. But outside of that, they can't see that. They don't have the ability to see what's going on now. They do have the ability to tell the future and the past. They know the history, and they know what's coming in the future. And Farinata even goes further to say that you can understand how all our knowledge will be completely dead at that time when the door to the future things is closed forever. He's talking about the final judgment, when time ceases to be, right? So at that point, there is no future, because time is not progressing any further. And if there is no future and time's not progressing, that means that the idea of the past no longer has meaning. What does it mean for there to be a past if time does not move? And so at that point, their eyes will be shut permanently. They no longer can see anything. They can't see what's going on now, and they can't see what happened in the past, and they can't see what's happening in the future. So basically, everyone's just counting down the days to the final judgment. There's like a lot of little notes I have in here that I think are interesting things to think about, but I don't want to really go into them. So things like, did Dante set comedy in 1300 to avoid addressing the role he played in the exile of Guido, contributing to his death eventually? So after Guido Cavalcante was exiled, he died shortly after, probably... I don't know. I don't remember exactly from what, but his exile definitely would have exacerbated whatever happened, and I think Dante felt responsible for playing a role in the exile of his friend. I think I always get their political affiliation mixed up. I think no, Guido was an atheist and he was a white Guelph, same as Dante. Okay. It is interesting in here, other little things that happen here and there. Things like he is holding information back from Virgil, his guide, but he is honest with Farinata. When he's talking to his guide, he says, his guide says, when Virgil says, while we are here and the wish you are keeping from me will be granted. And Dante says, no, I do not hide my heart. I'm trying not to talk too much. And then later, Farinata asks him who his ancestors are, because this is him, like, judging his political affiliation, because your political lines would have come from your family in this era. And he says, I held nothing back, which is kind of, like, weird. Why would you be honest with your enemies and deceitful toward your guide? Other little things, the Epicureans were a sect of religious belief that thought that... essentially, there's no such thing as a soul. Like, when your body dies, that's it. You don't go anywhere, which is strictly heterodoxical. That's heresy. So that's why they're there. But we do see other heretics in here. We'll encounter at least some other forms of heresy pretty soon. Anyway. That's Canto 10. Let's read Canto 11. We reached the curving brink of a steep bank, constructed of enormous broken rocks. Below us was a crueler den of pain. And the disgusting overflow of stench, the deep abyss was vomiting forced on us. Back from the edge. Oh, the deep abyss, the disgusting overflow of stench the deep abyss was vomiting forced us back from the edge. Crouched underneath the lid of some great tomb, I saw it inscribed. Within lies Anastasius, the Pope Photonius, lured away from the straight path. Our descent will have to be delayed somewhat so that our sense of smell may grow accustomed to these vile fumes. Then we will not mind them, my master said. And you will have to find some way to keep our time from being wasted. That is precisely what I had in mind, he said. And then began the lesson. My son, within these boulders' bounds are 3 more circles, concentrically arranged like those above, all tightly packed with souls, and so that later, the sight of them alone will be enough, I'll tell you how and why they are imprisoned. All malice has injustice as its end, an end achieved by violence or fraud, while both are sins that earn the hate of heaven. Since fraud belongs exclusively to man, God hates it more, and therefore far below the fraudulent are placed and suffer most. In the first of the circles below are the violent. Since violence can be used against 3 persons, into 3 concentric rounds is divided. Violence can be done to God, to self, or to one's neighbor, to him or to his goods, as by my reasoned explanation I will make clear. By violent means a man can kill his neighbor or wound him grievously. His goods may suffer violence by arson, theft, and devastation. So homicides and those who strike with malice, those who destroy and plunder, are all punished in the first round, but all in different groups. Man can raise violent hands against himself and his own goods. So in the second round, paying the debt that can never be paid, are suicides. Self-robbers of your world, or those who gamble all their wealth away, and weep up there when they should have rejoiced. One can use violence against the deity by heartfelt disbelief and cursing him, or by despising nature and God's bounty. Therefore the smallest round stamps with its seal both Sodom and Cahors, and all those souls who hate God in their hearts and curse his name. Fraud that gnaws on the conscience of his servants can be used on one who puts his trust in you, or else on one who has no trust invested. This latter sort seems to only destroy the bond of love that nature gives man, so in the second circle there are nests of hypocrites, flatterers, dabblers in sorcery, falsifiers, thieves, simoniacs, panderers, seducers, grafters, and like filth. The former kind of fraud both disregards the love of nature enjoys and that extra bond between men which creates a special trust. Thus, it is in the smallest of the circles at the earth's center around the throne of Dis that traitors suffer their eternal pain. And Master, your reasoning runs smooth, and your explanation certainly makes clear the nature of this pit and its inmates. But what about those in the slimy swamp? Those driven by the wind, those who beat the rain, and those who come to blows with harsh refrains. Why are they too not punished here inside the city of flame, if they have earned God's wrath? If they have not, why are they suffering? And he to me, why do you let your thoughts stray from the path they are accustomed to? Or have I missed the point you have in mind? Have you forgotten how your ethics reads? Those terms it explicates in such detail, the 3 conditions that the heavens hate: incontinence, malice, and bestiality. Do you not remember how incontinence offends God the least and merits the least blame? If you will reconsider well this doctrine, and then recall to mind those whose souls were suffering pain above outside the walls, you will clearly see why they are separated from those malicious ones, and why God's vengeance beats down upon their souls less heavily. O sun that shines to clear a misty vision, such joy is mine when you resolve my doubts, that doubting pleases me no less than knowing. Go back a little once more, I said, to where you say that usury offends God's goodness, and untie that knot for me. Philosophy, he said, and more than once points out to one who reads with understanding how nature takes her course from the divine intellect, from its artistic workmanship. And if you have read your physics well in mind, you will find, not many pages from the start, how your art too, as best as it can, imitates nature, the way an apprentice does his master. So your art might be said to be God's grandchild. From art and nature, man was meant to take his daily bread to live. If you recall the book of Genesis near the beginning, but the usurer, adopting other means, scorns nature in herself and her pupil. Art, he invests his hope in something else. Now follow me, we should be getting on. The fish are shimmering over the horizon. The wain is now exactly over Charos, and the passage down the bank is further on. So this canto is actually no plot progression happens, but this is the opportunity for the poet to explain in great detail how the construction of hell. This is more about the architecture of hell. So it explains who is where, why they're there, and where this breakdown comes from. So he starts off by explaining the 2 rings, the 2 major breakdowns below the heretics. So violence, and then fraud, which in classical Aristotelian thought would be broken down into incontinence, malice, and bestiality, where bestiality represents sort of bestial nature. That's the way that word is being used. So that is violence. You might think that malice means violence, but it's not. Bestiality is more in the vein of violence. This bestial nature where you have an animal-like nature to solve your problems. And then malice is sort of the meeting of wrath and intellect. It's where you use your power of divine intellect incorrectly. And so he breaks those down. In the Ring of the Violent, he talks about the way it's broken down: violence against others, violence against yourself, and violence against God. There's kind of some interesting discussion to be had there. How can one be violent against God? God is the great unmovable mover. And so how can one be violent against God? This usually comes from blasphemers, sodomites, and usurers. I'll talk about usury, but before I talk about that, I want to talk about sodomites. The only reference in pretty much the entirety of Inferno that what is being punished here might be sodomy is actually the fact that he says the smallest round stamps with its seal both Sodom and Cahors. Cahors is a city that was well known for usury, so this is referencing sodomites and usurers. But it's not... Dante... It's impressive how much he avoids the discussion of whether or not homosexuality and sodomy in general are sinful by their very nature. We're actually going to spend a long time, not just in Circle 7, but specifically in Circle 7, Violence Against God, the Sodomites, right? We spend 3 cantos just focusing on the Sodomites. And throughout all of that, it's easy to look at it and say, okay, he's punishing the homosexuals. But first off, not everyone who's punished there is homosexual. So that throws a huge wrench in it. And second, they're all sort of pointed out as having committed other types of sins. So it may not actually be... This may be an inclusion where sodomy is the shorthand explanation for a much broader thing, and we'll look at that as we go forward. I think what we're going to discover as we talk about it more is that the punishment we're going to see there is not punishment for homosexuality, but rather punishment for a bestial form of lust. What we're going to see there is the punishment is people who gave in to lust in such a way that it was animal-like in nature. And we'll talk about that more when we get to it. He also breaks down quite a lot of Circle 8. Circle 8 is fairly wild. There's a lot that's going on there. And he actually doesn't name every single type of sinner in Circle 8, which lends some credence to the idea that maybe he hadn't quite worked out what he was going to do with that area before he got there. And maybe he was still kind of figuring it out as he goes. Perhaps. So usury. I think Dante's explanation of usury is really fascinating to me. So I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version of what he said the crime of usury was. And essentially he's saying that art is a child of nature and nature is a child of God. So essentially art, your craft, your skills that you've developed is the grandchild of God. It is related directly to God. It is divine in its very nature. And the point of art, the point of our craft and our skills that we have are they're gifts from God that we use to provide for our daily bread. They provide for you can use it to provide for yourself. And the punishment for usury is that it's not that you are using your art to gain wealth, but rather you are using wealth to gain wealth, which is a perversion of God's intent. And so that's why usury is punished in this way. I mean, Dante would consider the stock market probably, yes, to be a form of usury. In that regard, yes. Dante is, from a theological perspective, seems much less concerned about the element of usury that most people are focused on, which is the idea of predatory loaning, basically using your money to harm other people, and seems much more concerned with the idea that you are not intended to make money from money. You're meant to make money from your craft, your art, by producing for the world and earning your daily bread that way. So that's the basic premise of what he talks about with usury. He also talks about, so the question was posed by Dante. He asks, well, why then were the people above, those driven by the wind, those beat by the rain, those who come to blow with harsh refrains, those in the slimy swamp? He asks, well, why are they down here below the walls of Dis? And he says, well, that's the realm of incontinence, which, according to ethics, which is a reference to a book, Aristotelian writings, is punished less. It is less. It causes God less suffering. It causes God less unhappiness. God's vengeance beats down upon their souls less heavily. By the way, a lot of translators use the word vengeance over and over, which is a perfectly fine word. I think that we often associate vengeance with God's wrath and things like that. But in the original medieval Florentine, a lot of times the word that's being used by Dante is vendetta, which I think bears out a slightly different meaning. At least the way that we think of the word vendetta. It's almost as if, rather than thinking of it as God is angry that you've sinned, it's rather that your sin has harmed God and God is taking revenge almost. And I think that represents the sort of. I think that helps. I think that viewpoint makes it clearer the architecture of hell a little better. Is that this is sort of recompense for harm attempted to be inflicted upon God. As he goes on, he again is able to reference the stars in heaven as a time marker. I don't know how he's managing to do it, but he says the fish are shimmering over the horizon. That's a reference to the constellation Pisces. He says the Wain is now directly over Caurus. The Wain is Ursa Major. Why does he know the positions of the constellations in heaven, considering he's about halfway down through hell? Who knows? You'll have to take that up with him. I think I'm going to put a pin in it here. We're through 11 cantos, which means that I can break Inferno into 3 segments, I think. Also, I've been reading for 3.5 hours, so I'm very tired. So, I think I'm going to put a pin in it here. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I have. I was asked, someone asked earlier, where did I get my notes? So I've gotten them from a number of places. I own like 6 different copies of Inferno, each with their own notes. I've got the copy by the Hollanders. I have some notes that are from some old commentaries. I've got Mark Muse's notes. J. Simon Harrison just produced a new translation. I bought it and I'm going to get it soon. The notes that come with the Hollanders translation and Ciardi's translation are both amazing notes. They're prodigious notes. So if you want to know more about it, getting a copy that has good notes can teach you a lot. And then on top of that, I've also been listening to a podcast, Walking with Dante, by Mark Scarborough, who is incredible. And he goes through 30-minute episodes that cover like 10 lines of the poem at a time and talks about every reference. And so when I hear things that I like, that I want to remember, I scribble them as notes in my book so I can remember them. So a lot of this is cribbed from Mark Scarborough, who has also cribbed his notes from the Hollanders and from Ciardi and from famous commentators through antiquity. Panacotic, thank you so much for the 1,000 bits. I really appreciate it. So there's a lot of commentary tradition. I'm mostly just following in the footsteps. I'm reading it. I mean, I have nothing really to contribute to it all that much, but I find it fascinating, so. Jay Mullen, thank you so much for the 500 bits. I really appreciate it. If you're looking for a good copy with notes, I recommend the Ciardi translation. The thing about the Ciardi translation is that it's written in almost terza rima. It's written in a rhyme scheme where he just rhymes the first and last lines of every tercet, which is close. It's kind of terza rima, but he gives himself some license. Those kind of translations I usually avoid because in order to make rhyme schemes work, you often have to make sacrifices to the fidelity of the translation. I am, however, looking forward to having myself proved wrong, because J. Simon Harrison's translation comes out, is in the mail on its way to me right now, and he wrote it in full terza rima, but supposedly he tried to be really faithful to the translation, so I'm really looking forward to reading his notes. But if you're just looking for a copy that's easy to read and has good notes, the Ciardi translation, Ciardi, Ciardi, is usually the go-to. His writing is readable, it's very fluid and very easy to understand, and his notes are best described as prodigious. The only translation I really can't recommend, honestly, is the Longfellow translation. Not because it's a bad translation. It has some problems, but it's written in Old English, so it's very hard to read in 2021, 2022, whatever year it is. Yeah, thank you everyone for hanging out. I'll do this again sometime soon. Longfellow is the translation gets republished very often because it's the only one to my knowledge that's in the public domain. I'm not reading the Longfellow translation, but I will not state which translation I'm reading just in case. Just in case, I will not tell you which translation I'm reading.